May 1789. The Palace of Versailles. 1,200 deputies file in. Velvet and satin robes of clergy and nobles flash colour, while the Third Estate's delegates, draped plainly in black, sit quietly in their cramped rows. At the front, Louis XVI perches on a gilded throne, an anxious weight of a realm on his shoulders, and to his left, on a slightly lower step, sits Queen Marie Antoinette. It is the morning of May 5th, 1789, the opening of the Estates General, and the first National Assembly in France in 175 years. The King's beloved finance minister, Jacques Necker, enters to a roar of applause from the Third Estate benches. Even the liberal Duke of Orleans earns a cheering. But as Louis himself rises to speak, a kind of hush falls. His short address is delivered in a steady, proud tone, befitting of a Bourbon monarch. Courtiers and loyalists erupt in the usual warm acclamation. Tears well in the eyes of at least one onlooker overcome by the emotion of the moment. In the galleries, a few sob with relief, as the king pledges to listen to his people. But notably, when the queen dabs her eyes, the hall still stays silent. Not a single cheer for La Reine. The common people's affection for the monarchy, it seems, hangs by a thread. Louis clears his throat and glances at his wife knowingly. Whispers ripple among the courtiers as an awkward ceremony of hat doffing ensues. Nobles imitating the king's motions. Third Estate deputies unsure whether to keep their hats on or off. The queen furrows her brow at the break in protocol, but Louis gently waves it off. It is a moment heavy with symbolism, you see. Centuries-old custom, colliding with a restive present. As the session adjourns, cries of "Vive le roi" thunder from the crowd, echoing off the painted ceilings. And for the first time in months, a tentative shout of "Vive la Reine" rises as well, answered by the Queen's delicate curtsy. But beneath the surface of the curtsies there is that unease simmering. In the back of the hall the delegates of the Third Estate exchange hard looks with members of those privileged orders. They all have arrived, believing that they are here to save France from ruin. But everybody has a different definition of what saving France actually means. When they return the next day, they must begin the great debate. How will they vote? By unified head count or separate orders? And who truly speaks for the nation's will? Those are the big questions. Louis departs, amid a polite clapping, but his face is noticeably pale. In that charged hall a long-contained tension is building, and by the time these same people meet again, this solemn assembly will become a battlefield of words and principle. It seems that the old world is falling apart. The world of the old regime is about to be replaced. Well, I hope our little introduction set the scene there. We need to put ourselves in the shoes of not just the common people later on who will play quite a role, but also the monarchy. After all, there's plenty of moving parts here in 1789. So I mentioned those three estates. Let's explain that. You see, for centuries, French society was officially divided thus. At the very top stood the First Estate, the clergy of the Catholic Church, numbering perhaps about 100,000 in a nation of 27 million. Next came the Second Estate, the nobility, no more than 400,000. The Third Estate, an overwhelming majority of roughly 27 million, pretty much made up everybody else, from prosperous bourgeois lawyers and merchants in cities down to peasants toiling in the fields. This hierarchy dated back to medieval conceptions of society, sort of a leftover of the old feudal system. Those who pray, those who fight, and those who work. It was more than just social prestige, but it determined legal rights, duties, and perhaps most importantly, who paid the bills. Under the old regime, privilege was king. The first estate, clergy, owned about 10% of France's land and enjoyed vast exemptions, pretty much get away with anything. And the church paid no direct taxes to the state at all, which is quite the superpower. Instead, it occasionally offered a free gift to the treasury, but this was all negotiated on its own terms. The clergy collected tithes, a tenth of people's harvest for itself, controlled most schools and hospitals, and even censored publications, entwining religious authority with royal authority in daily life. The second estate of the nobility also held quite a few privileges. Many noble families lived off lucrative lands and feudal dues. Collectively, nobles owned about 1/5 of the French land. Nobles filled all the top offices in government, the military, and the courts, with the glaring exception of King Louis XVI finance minister Jacques Necker, a common-born Swiss banker. We'll talk about him a little bit more later. Now, in law, nobles were set apart by honors, like the right to wear a sword, and critically, by tax exemptions. The most useful privilege was exemption from the basic royal land tax, the taille. By tradition, the nobility had shed blood to defend the kingdom, and thus they did not have to pay money as well. Their ancestors' blood tax was considered to be enough of a contribution. In practice, though, by Louis XVI's reign, some token taxes had been extended to nobles, i.e. they were liable for a poll tax per head and a 5% income tax called the vingtième. But even these could be watered down or evaded by invoking privilege. Many wealthy nobles paid far less, of course, proportionately than far poorer commoners. And so, the burden of financing the state fell crushingly to all of those common people, the Third Estate. Now, the Third Estate, of course, was 98% of the nation, from urban artisans to peasants, bearing almost all the burden, and not getting many of the benefits. This estate included the burgeoning bourgeois, educated commoners who had grown in number and wealth. Yet even wealthy bourgeois found themselves buying exemptions or privileges piecemeal to ease their burdens. As a group, commoners faced the taille, the land tax, the capitation, head tax, and the vingtième, a 5% tax on income, which in practice hit the Third Estate the hardest. Then there was the gabelle, a hated salt tax. If you know anything about cooking, especially back in those times, that was going to hit people pretty hard. And then there was all these little things. There were the countless local fees, tolls, and feudal dues. In much of the countryside, peasants owed labor to their lords. The corvée was called unpaid work on roads, things like that. They also paid dues for using the lord's mill or wine press, and tithed to the church on top of royal taxes. All in all, the system was dizzyingly complex. France had regional differences. In some provinces, local estates assemblies bargained over taxes, while in others the king's officials dictated the amounts and were quite strict. Tax collection itself was often privatized. Powerful financiers known as tax farmers paid the crown for the right to collect certain taxes, like the salt tax, and then extracted as much as they could, sometimes brutally. Of course, these were not the most popular people in France at all. We can certainly say that. Now, this also led to widespread corruption and resentment. No surprises there. A popular caricature from 1789 drives the point home. It depicts a gaunt figure of the Third Estate, literally carrying a fat nobleman and a portly cleric on his back. The caption reads, "I hope this game will be over soon." The meaning was clear. For generations, the labors of the common people had propped up the entire old order. By the late 18th century, the burden felt intolerable. Voices were crying that the game of unequal privilege must end. You can see where this is going, right? And indeed, complaints about this unjust machine of state were rife by 1789. One provincial noble list of grievances conceded that taxation should fall on all property equally. A quote from the list says, "If a tax is the price paid for the protection which government accords to property, it follows that all property should pay equally." Yeah, fair enough. Makes sense, right? Well, in the same spirit, deputies of the nobility in Blois volunteered to surrender their fiscal exemptions on the condition that the clergy do the same, so that, quote, "no exemption whatsoever shall be retained in any favor of any class of citizens." Such enlightened nobles were, however, a minority. This typical noble grandee guarded his liberties and exemptions jealously. The clergy, too, insisted on their autonomy and freedom from state taxes. At the pinnacle, the king enjoyed the ultimate privilege. He was the source of law and authority, accountable to no one except God. This was absolutism, the political theory that had defined France since the 17th century, emboldened by Louis's famous dictum, "L'État, c'est moi." I am the state. But in reality, Louis inherited a throne enmeshed in constraints. Tradition, entrenched interests, and parliaments, that is, high courts, all limited the crown's power to act. Over the 18th century, the monarchy had actually grown weaker, not stronger. Kings had struck a tacit bargain with noble elites in exchange for social and fiscal privileges. The nobility generally acquiesced to royal rule. That deal kept France stable under strong monarchs, but it left the kingdom alarmingly short of revenue, since the wealth of the privileged went largely untapped. And by the 1780s, this arrangement was buckling under its own inequity. One contemporary critic quipped that the realm's finances were like a fabulous machine all composed of cogs and wheels within wheels that the genius of man could have never invented twice. And it was grinding towards a breakdown. Who or what could force change? The crown's traditional tools, edicts from kings enforced by the courts, they were all failing. Things were not working anymore. People were not going to put up with it. A legitimacy crisis was growing. Common people increasingly asked why an idle noble or high-born bishop should speak for the nation, while the productive Third Estate was completely voiceless. In the streets and in pamphlets, a bold idea was spreading. Sovereignty should reside not in an anointed king alone, nor in privileged orders, but in the nation as a whole. And in 1789, that idea would challenge the old machine to a fight. By the late 1780s, the French monarchy was caught up in a financial vice, a money trap, largely of its own policies and making. You see, decades of war and extravagant spending had loaded the state up with an immense debt, and the antiquated tax system failed to produce enough revenue to pay it down. Louis's government teetered on the edge of bankruptcy. In fact, by 1788, fully half of the state's annual budget was devoured just by interest payments on the debt. So imagine this, half of everything that France's government collected went straight to creditors. Now that's fiscal rot, if I ever heard of it. The crown's debt had ballooned to perhaps 4 billion livres, which is French pounds, and that's an enormous sum. By 1789, roughly equivalent to 80% of France's gross national product. The reasons were numerous, of course, but two stood out. One was war. That was all in the past. We can't really change that. But the second was courtly indulgence. Well, for a century, French kings had pursued glory on the battlefield and influence abroad, running up huge bills while they did it. The War of Austrian Succession in the 1740s and the 7 Years' War between 1756 rather, and 1763, well, they were especially ruinous. The latter conflict, essentially the first global war pitting France against Great Britain, ended in disaster. France lost colonies in Canada and India and piled up debt with very little to show for it. They were basically beaten up and dead broke. But then there was a bit of an ironic twist. Louis XVI, who came to the throne in 1774, plunged into supporting the American War of Independence from 1775 to 83, and he spent over 1.5 billion livres to aid the American rebels against Britain. It was a victory in geopolitical terms. Britain was humbled. But as for the French, well, they were just broke. By 1786, the treasury was virtually empty. One minister famously reported that without drastic change, the monarchy would not meet its expenses even for the next year. But like I said, that was all in the past. There was nothing they could do about it now. What really got the public minds back up was the extravagance at court. The royal court at Versailles cost a fortune to maintain. Thousands of courtiers were on royal pensions, elaborate ceremonies, palaces, hunting lodges, and jewelry. It all just swallowed up the taxes. No figure attracted more ire than Queen Marie Antoinette, nicknamed Madame Deficit. Her perceived frivolous spending, silk gowns, diamond bracelets, masked balls, and her private pleasure hamlet farm retreat, they all became a lightning rod for popular resentment. Pamphlets and gutter-press tabloids painted her as a spendthrift, and even a traitor. Bear in mind she was Austrian at birth. They pretty much just blamed her for France's every ill. Anything they could stick onto her, they did. And so, by the late 1780s, the Queen's reputation was so abysmal that wild rumors struck. One British observer noted that common Parisians truly believed Marie Antoinette's plan to blow up the city, or even that she was hoarding grain to starve the people. Such was the climate of suspicion. But in reality, court expenses were only a slice of the budget compared to war costs. The thing is, symbolically, they were devastating. The monarchy appeared out of touch and self-indulgent. Of course, they'd always appeared out of touch and self-indulgent, but no one really wanted to speak up about it. It's just that right now it was the worst possible time. So staring down at this crisis, Louis XVI cycled through financial ministers, desperate to find a solution. One of the first, Anne Robert Turgot, tried to reform from 1774 to 1776. A disciple of the Enlightenment and economic liberalism, Turgot believed in cutting waste and freeing commerce. He abolished the onerous corvée labor tax and moved to deregulate the grain trade to prevent shortages. He even proposed taxing previously exempt groups. Quote, "No bankruptcy, no increases of taxes, no new loans. France must live within its own means." But vested interests rebelled. Nobles and magistrates were not too pleased at losing their privileges. Violent bread riots greeted his free trade policies after prices rose. Under pressure from the Queen's clique and the noble-dominated parliaments, the high courts, Turgot was, shoved out the door. But as he left a bit of a warning to Louis. "Remember, sire, that it was weakness which brought down the head of Charles I. In other words, giving in to privileged demands is going to end in disaster." Now, Next came the Swiss banker Jacques Necker, who took a different tack. Necker cleverly used loans to keep the state afloat. He was skilled at selling French bonds across Europe. In 1781, he released the Compte Rendu, a public report on the royal finances, Europe's first experiment in fiscal transparency. It was meant to inspire confidence, and it did among the public, who lionized Necker for his apparent probity. But the Compte Rendu was a little misleading. You see, Necker was not as honest as he could have been. He cooked the books, showing a surplus by omitting the costly war outlays. Effectively, he just created propaganda to calm the public down. The truth was, France was still in a deficit. Necker, like Turgot, also trod on noble toes by trimming pensions lists and questioning court spending. He too was eventually pushed out by enemies at court. After Necker's departure, the monarchy's credit worsened. By 1786, the new minister, Charles Alexandre de Calonne, had to admit the ugly truth, and that was that the state was flat broke. In Calonne's assessment, debt service and expenses exceeded revenue by a shocking 100 million livres per year. France was insolvent. Calonne decided that only radical change could save the monarchy from default. In 1787, he proposed a comprehensive reform plan: universal land tax, ending exemptions for nobles and clergy, abolition of internal trade barriers and the cruel salt tax, plus new local assemblies to approve taxes. The package would shift the burden onto those who had long escaped it and tap France's immense noble and ecclesiastical wealth. But he knew that Parliament would veto such reforms, so Calonne took an unusual step. He convened an assembly of notables, a hand-picked group of 144 eminent men, princes, bishops, nobles, magistrates, hoping that they would rubber-stamp the plan for the king. It backfired spectacularly. The notables, meeting in early 1787, balked. Many distrusted Calonne's motives or resented that an upstart minister demanded they surrender privileges. Some perhaps foresaw that endorsing new taxes on themselves would erode the very foundations of noble status. In a surprise turn, the notables declared that such sweeping changes exceeded their authority. Only the great States General of the entire nation could consent to new taxes, they argued. This was a bombshell. By invoking the Estates General, they were in effect saying that the king alone could not impose these new taxes, and that's a direct challenge to absolutism. Louis XVI was stunned. In April of 1787, he dismissed Calonne, hoping to calm the waters. But the fiscal crisis only deepened. Etienne de Brienne, an archbishop and friend of the Queen, took charge. Brienne kept parts of Calonne's program and attempted to push them through Parliament. The Parlement of Paris, the most important high court, had long cast itself as a guardian of the fundamental laws of France. Brienne presented the land tax edict to them in July of 1787, and they were not too pleased. The result was uproar. The Parliament, led by determined magistrates like Duval de Premesnil, flatly refused and echoed the notables. Only an Estates General representing the nation could approve such things. They even issued a ringing remonstrance that, quote, the constitutional principle of the French monarchy was that taxes should be consented to by those who have to bear them. What an idea, Well, in effect, the king's own courts accused his government of violating such a social contract. Crowds in Paris cheered the magistrates as popular heroes resisting tyranny. Sensing the monarchy's weakness, parliaments in other cities followed suit. A wave of what came to be called the aristocratic revolt swept the country's elites. Louis At last went the nuclear option. Well, at least the musket option. He adopted force. On August 6, 1787, he held a lit de justice, a royal session, to compel registration of tax edicts over parliamentary objections. It degenerated into a farce. The king fell asleep during the heated processions, to the embarrassment of all, jokes aside. Well, the next day, the Parliament of Paris declared the force edicts null and void. An exasperated and frustrated Louis then exiled the Parliament, sending troops to shut down its chambers and ordering the magistrates to remote Troyes. Rather than cower to opposition, this provoked street protests and even riots in support of the exiled court. "Long live the Parlement," rang out in Paris, an unsettling twist, given these judges had often been seen as reactionary in the past. But frustration and hunger were making strange bedfellows. Common citizens were now lining up with aristocratic magistrates simply because they defied the crown. Hunger whets everything, especially suspicion and indignation, observed the writer Thomas Carlyle, and indeed the public was quick to assume the worst of the king's motives. In pamphlets, the parlements were praised as tribunes of the people, while the royal ministers were condemned as despots. The pressure was all too much. By late 1787, Briand compromised. He withdrew the land tax plan and agreed to call in the States General by 1792. The concession was not enough, I'm afraid. France's credit was exhausted and loans could no longer be raised. In July of 1788, with the treasury empty, Briand's government suspended payments on the debt and admission of bankruptcy. The national humiliation was complete. Louis was out of options. He bowed to the inevitable. On August 8, 1788, he issued a decree convening the Estates General for May of that coming year. The Parlement, rather ironically, restored from exile, preened at their victory. They had forced the king's hand. Amid public rejoicing, Louis also brought back the popular Necker as finance minister, hoping to regain trust. But the monarchy's authority was fatally weakened. Centuries-old absolutism had, in a few complicated months, given way to the notion that the nation would now be calling the shots. As the astute observer Alexis de Tocqueville later noted, experience teaches that the most dangerous moment for a bad government is usually when it begins to reform itself. And Louis XVI had begun to reform. He now faced a whirlwind. The question on everyone's lips: when the Estates General met, who would truly speak for the nation? Well, that is the stage set for a struggle over legitimacy that would really unite the revolution. Took a while to get to it, but we do have to explain the whole background of this. In any case, let's move on. So even as the political crisis gripped the elite, there was a more elemental crisis gripping the ordinary French people, and that's the crisis of bread. It's the yeast of their problems. Anyway, by the spring of 1789, France was in the throes of a severe subsistence emergency. Perfect storm of bad weather, poor harvests, and soaring food prices that left the masses hungry. And, well, you're not yourself when you're hungry, aren't you? They were getting quite desperate and angry. This disaster was not the direct handiwork of any king or minister, but it certainly magnified popular discontent and primed the country for unrest. Well, when the cost of the bread suddenly doubled, and by the way, people in the French Revolution were spending 50% of their income on food in normal times or around that, it was as if the floor fell out beneath the commoner's life. They were left scrambling to survive, and in their fury they cast about for someone to blame. The trouble had begun with freakish weather. In July of 1788, a catastrophic hailstorm, noted from one account, a quote, calamity from which the French nation, just as the Parliament rebelled, hit, swept across large swaths of France. While in mere hours, hail the size of stones shredded crops from Normandy to the Rhone. Wheat fields were flattened. Orchards were ruined. This came on top of a very wet spring, which had already harmed the grain yield. And then, cruelly, the winter of 1788 to 89 arrived early, and it was, in layman's terms, bloody cold. Rivers froze. Mills could not turn to grind flour. Snow blanketed the ground into late April. The cumulative effect was devastating. The harvest of 1788 was one of the worst of the century. As supplies of grain dwindled, the price of bread, the staple of life, shot upward by 50%, and then doubled again in many areas. In Paris, a 4-pound bread loaf that cost 8 sous in 1787 now cost 15 by February of the following year. For context, the unskilled laborer might earn 20 sous a day. So, you're spending that much just on a piece of bread, come on. Now, feeding a whole family, they could take nearly all of that, even if bread was available. Well, there was a report from the Comte de Mirbeau from the provinces in July of 1789. People are starving to death, with wheat all around them for want of flour, or the mills are frozen. Those who had money hoarded bread. Those who did not formed long bread lines at dawn, growing frustrated and violent if the baker ran out. Hunger gnawed at belly and mind alike. This acute scarcity fueled fear, and in the 18th century France, famine and fear easily turned into paranoia. The common people had long held suspicion and conspiracies by the rich to undermine their survival, a belief historians later called the famine plot. As grain vanished and prices soared, many poor folk became convinced that somebody must be orchestrating their misery. Rumors spread. Grain merchants or aristocratic speculators were supposedly hoarding grain in secret warehouses to drive the prices higher, or the Queen and her circle were exporting flour to enemies, or farmers were in league to starve the cities. Well, in reality, none of this was true, at least not at scale. 1788's harvest failure was simply just a natural disaster. But that never really stops people from whispering and panicking. Hunger whets everything, especially suspicion and indignation. Realities themselves, in this Paris, have grown unreal. Phantasms stalk through the brain of hungry France, wrote Thomas Carlyle, capturing the popular mood. Those phantoms would soon have real effects, you see. In the countryside, starving peasants began raiding granaries and convoys determined to seize the hoarded grain they believed to be hidden. In towns, women in bread queues hurled insults not just at bakers, but at wealthy passers-by, convinced that the well-to-do somehow must be behind their suffering. When one wealthy factory owner in Paris, Varennes, was rumored to have said workers' wages should be cut because bread was too expensive, it lit the fuse of outrage. In April 1789, just days before the Estates General convened, a mob in Paris sacked Varennes' mansion and factory in a terrifying riot. Up to 300 rioters were killed by troops in the chaos. The Varennes riot was one of the revolution's first bloody eruptions, born from economic fear and class anger. As one observer noted, the crowd had not forgotten their belief that the elites were hoarding grain, and any hint of callousness by the rich, well, that was enough to send them into a rage. Throughout that spring, reports flooded into Versailles about food riots and peasant unrest. In one market town after another, Hungry crowds demanded that grain be sold at a just price, not the soaring market rate. They forced officials to set price caps or seize the grain outright, a phenomenon known as popular taxation. When local authorities tried to disperse them, or soldiers were called in, violence often followed. In the north of France, bakeries were pillaged. In Orléans, a crowd sacked boats they thought were carrying grain for export. Outside the city of Troyes, peasants emptied the Lord's granary and sold the wheat themselves at what they deemed to be a fair price. The military was summoned repeatedly to preserve the peace of the markets, and by the time the Estates General met in May, the fabric of order in some regions was threadbare. As Arthur Young, an English traveller in France, wrote in early 1789, quote, "The want of bread is terrible. Accounts arrive every moment from the provinces of riots and disturbances. The prices are beyond the faculties of the poor, and occasion great misery." End quote. He added that reports spoke of rioters running off with bread and wheat for nothing. Famine made the people nearly ungovernable. Even calm voices like the Marquis de Ferrières wrote, "The scarcity of bread has aggravated their evils to almost madness." A Paris newspaper warned in late July of 1789 that when stomachs are empty, there is no extremity to which people might not be driven. A dire prophecy, already coming true. Thus, on the eve of the revolution, subsistence anxiety made politics completely combustible. The deputies arriving at Versailles at 1789 carried with them thick notebooks of grievances from their constituents. The chief among the Third Estate's list was the high prices of bread and the dread of hunger. Village petitions begged the king to curb these monopolizers and ensure fair grain distribution. But in truth, Louis XVI was quite sympathetic to the plight. You see, during the winter he had ordered grain imports and forbidden exports in hope of easing the shortages. But such measures were too little too late. Common people didn't necessarily see the king as a villain. Many still believed Le Bon Roi cared for them and was evil ministers and profiteers to really blame. Still, the suffering sharpened the question of legitimacy. Who was responsible for the people's well-being? The old paternalistic promise of the monarchy that the king would ensure bread in mouths was faltering. And if he's not doing that, well, what good is he? If the royal government couldn't prevent famine, or was perhaps even complicit in causing it, as rumours held, then perhaps power needed to be held accountable in new ways. In taverns and on street corners, people openly discussed ideas that were once the, preserve of the philosophers, rights, justice, and the social contract. The Enlightenment's critiques of oppression found a ready audience among desperate and hungry folk. And as we shall see, when news came in July 1789 that the king's troops might move against the people, Paris's citizens, driven by the memory of empty bread ovens, would not hesitate to take up arms themselves. But before that point is reached, an extraordinary awakening in public consciousness was already underway, and that was thanks to the spread of new ideas. You see, underpinning the entire crisis of the late 1780s was this quieter revolution, an intellectual transformation that had unfolded over the preceding few decades. The European Enlightenment had seeded France with new ideas about authority, rights, and reason, and by 1789 those ideas had burst out of salons and academies into the public arena. What made this especially potent was the rapid expansion of the public sphere. The word of print, discussion, and opinion accessible beyond the royal court. In essence, ideas went public. Pamphlets poured off presses, journals proliferated, and ordinary people gathered around at tables in cafes to debate the affairs of the realm. This democratization of discourse eroded the mystique of the old regime. No longer were decisions simply edicts from on high. Now pamphleteers and orators questioned who was really deciding and on what authority. By 1789, the principle of authority itself was on trial. By the mid-1700s, you see, Enlightenment philosophies like Voltaire, Montesquieu, and Rousseau had boldly critiqued tradition and championed reason. Their work circulated widely in France, even if sometimes clandestinely to evade censors. Voltaire, in particular, skewered the church's intolerances and the nobility's pretensions. Montesquieu, in The Spirit of the Laws of 1748, praised Britain's balanced constitution and implied that France's absolutism was despotic. Rousseau, in The Social Contract, 1762, proclaimed, "Man is born free, and everywhere he is in chains," arguing that legitimate government must rest on the general will of the people, not the whim of a monarch. Of course, such ideas percolated among the educated classes, sometimes dismissed by the powerful as abstract theories. But they found practical resonance in the late 1780s as the old regime was floundering. The notion that sovereignty came from the nation, not just from hereditary right, gained real traction. One example is the Abbé Emmanuel Sieyès, a quiet clergyman turned radical pamphleteer. In January 1789, he published What is the Third Estate, a pamphlet that electrified public discourse. Quote, "What is the Third Estate? Everything. What has it been until now in the political order? Nothing. What does it want to be? Something." Sieyès declared, in this rather scorching prose, that the Third Estate, the common people of France, was, in substance, the nation, but they had no voice in power. The privileged orders, he existed, were parasites. Quote, "If the privileged order should be abolished, the nation would not be something less, but something more." Sieyès gave intellectual ammunition to the legitimacy crisis. He framed it as a simple question of justice. If the Third Estate is everything, why should it remain politically nothing? Damn good question. Well, thanks to an explosion of print media, his words would reach tens of thousands. His pamphlet was said to have sold 30,000 copies in a matter of weeks, which at that time is an extraordinary number. And it was but one of a flood of pamphlets between 1788 and 89 as the Estates General approached. A pamphlet war was raging across France. Over 1,000 pamphlets were published in the late 1788 and early 1789 years, debating how the Estates General should be constituted and what reforms were needed. And this was a new phenomenon, a great national debate conducted in print for the public. Literacy had increased, and where people couldn't read, they gathered to hear what others could. In Paris, the Palais Royal Gardens became an open-air forum where hawkers sold pamphlets and crowds discussed politics openly under the tolerating gaze of the Duke of Orleans, a royal prince with liberal sympathies who owned that enclave. Newspapers and political clubs also emerged in these months. The old royal censorship apparatus was overwhelmed, indeed partly dismantled by the Crown itself in 1788 to allow freer discussion about the coming Estates General. The result? Unprecedented. The role of printed matter in the production of public opinion increased dramatically, as one historian noted. A public sphere had formed, where public opinion became a force that statesmen had to consider. The very idea of public opinion as a political factor was an Enlightenment product. By 1789, it was widely believed that the people, or at least propertied citizens, had the right to discuss and influence governance. In cities, salons and coffee houses were hotbeds. Salons, often hosted by prominent women like Madame Necker and Madame de Stael, brought together nobles, bourgeois, and intellectuals to exchange ideas politely, if sometimes contentiously. You see, coffee houses were more democratic. Any man with a few sous for a cup of coffee could sit and read the latest gazettes or join a debate. Paris hosted dozens of them, each with its political flavor. One might be frequented by radical journalists, another by moderates. Information flowed in these places: foreign news, parliamentary debates in Britain, American revolutionary principles. They were all digested by educated Parisians. Masonic lodges, semi-secret fraternal clubs devoted to Enlightenment ideals, also provided networks for reformists among the elite. But all this ferment meant that by 1789, broad swaths of the French populace was politicized like never before. The convening of the Estates General further fanned the flames. In early 1789, every locality held elections for delegates and crafted notebooks of grievances. Now, these notebooks are remarkable testaments to public engagement. From the smallest village to the heart of Paris, people listed their complaints and their hopes. Common themes emerged: ending tax exemptions, establishing regular representative assemblies, freedom of the press, justice under the law, and relief from feudal dues and the salt tax. Many of these notebooks called for a constitution to enshrine rights. Even rural peasants, often stereotyped as ignorant of politics, articulated a clear desire for a more equitable order. They had heard the ideas of equality and natural rights discussed, and it all sounded pretty good to them. They were eager to see these ideas applied. The Enlightenment's influence was evident. The Declaration of the Rights of Man and Citizen, which would come in August 1789, did not spring from nowhere. Its concepts of liberty, property, and resistance to oppression had been percolating in French culture for decades. Pamphleteers in 1809 invoked the Montesquieu on the separation of powers, Voltaire on religious tolerance, and Rousseau on general will. Crucially, these ideas were no longer confined to philosophers. Lawyers, priests, merchants, and soldiers were talking about them. A young provincial lawyer named Maximilien Robespierre, yes, we'll get to him later, rose in his local assembly to insist the forthcoming Estates General must respect the will of the people. Enlightenment incarnate in a local advocate. But perhaps most striking was the challenge to absolute authority, where once the king was practically beyond criticism. By 1809, even that barrier had fallen. Politely, the notebooks asked for more regular meetings of the Estates General and a written constitution, effectively putting the king under law. Less politely, anonymous pamphlets lambasted despotic ministers and even Louis's own decisions. One widely read pamphlet thundered that the nation had the right to hold its rulers accountable, citing philosophers as justification. In any case, the genie of political expression was out of the bottle. And with free expression came impassioned voices that could sway the masses. Figures like Count Mirabeau, an eloquent, noble deputy despite his scandalous past, or Camille Desmoulins, a fiery young journalist, emerged as a popular tribune. In 1789, the month of June, Desmoulins would ignite the crowd to take arms by delivering an impromptu speech at the Palais Royal, testament to how far the culture of public oratory had come. But even before things erupted into violence, the pens of pamphleteers were tilting the balance. As one conservative observer noted with panic in early 1789, the current is overwhelmingly in favor of the Third Estate. Public opinion supports their claims. And yet, indeed, by the time of the Estates General convening, the Third Estate's call for equality in representation and voting had become a rallying cry, and one well beyond its own ranks. The idea that legitimacy comes from representing the people, not from historical privilege, that was the talk of the town. In short, the late 1780s saw an enlightenment of the public. Knowledge and new ideas escaped the salons and became tools of the people. Well, the authority of tradition and hierarchy was now countered by reason and public opinion. Now, that is not to say that everybody was grinding the works of Rousseau or Voltaire directly, of course, but simplified slogans and concepts did penetrate. Liberté, égalité, things like that. The very term citizen began to replace subject in political talk, indicating a shift from viewing people as the king's charges to viewing them as active members of a nation. When the deputies of '89 gathered, they carried this intellectual arsenal with them. Many were lawyers, steeped in Enlightenment writings, ready to duel with arguments as much as votes. Thus, the France that entered 1789 was a nation not only in economic and political crisis, but in the midst of a mental revolution. That question again, who has the right to speak for the nation? Unaskable a generation earlier. Well, now it was on everybody's lips. Enlightenment ideas had undermined the sacred aura of the throne and the altar, and a literate, engaged public was screaming its voice. The old consensus about legitimacy was gone. Was it the king by divine right, the nobles by blood, the church by tradition, or was it the people themselves who now constituted authority? The unanswered question would soon be resolved in the most dramatic of fashions. So, here we are, the spring of 1789, where events were hurtling forward with a momentum that few could have predicted. France's old regime had entered a death spiral, a rapid sequence of attempted fixes and political concessions that only spurred more demand for change. The calling of the Estates General itself was the culmination of this spiral. The final admission that the absolutist monarchy could not solve its problems alone. Yet even as the deputies headed to Versailles to begin their deliberations, conflict was brewing over how those deliberations would proceed. What should have been the solution, the Estates General, was about to trigger a new, revolutionary crisis. As the delegates arrived from every corner of France, each bearing the hopes of their communities, everybody believed they were coming to save the day. But of course, everyone had different ideas. These differences would explode almost immediately once the Estates General opened. The summoning of the Estates General was itself an extraordinary moment. Not since 1614 had this body met. It was a relic from a distant past. In essence, it was a nationwide parliament of the three estates, with representatives elected separately by each estate in each district. Well, when Louis announced it for May of 1789, a thrill of excitement had swept the country. Pamphlets and political clubs feverishly debated on how it would operate, and two key issues emerged: representation and voting. Would the third estate, representing 98% of the population, have proportionate say? And would decisions be taken by voting by head, i.e. counting each deputy's vote equally, or by order, each estate voting internally and having one collective vote? The latter method, used in 1614, would give the first and second estates the ability to outvote third 2-1, perpetuating a noble clergy dominance. The third estate and its sympathizers vehemently opposed this. An intense pamphlet campaign in 1788 argued that justice required the third estate to have double representation, twice as many deputies as each of the other estates, and that voting would be done by head count. Faced with public pressure, the King's Council made the decision in December of 1788. It granted the demand for doubling the third estate's numbers. The third would send about 600 deputies, equal to the two other estates' deputies combined. But on the critical matter of voting procedure, the edict was silent. It did not clarify whether votes would be counted by head or by order. The submission was intentional. Louis hoped to postpone this thorny issue, but in reality it just guaranteed a showdown. The elections followed. In early 1789, towns and villages chose their delegates. The results showed a France both united in hope and divided in estate loyalties. The First Estate largely sent conservative higher clergy, though about a third of elected parish priests were more sympathetic to the commons. The Second Estate elected mostly provincial nobles, many of whom were reform-minded liberals, but also many jealous of their caste interests. The Third Estate had an impressive array of educated men, lawyers, magistrates, officials, a handful of writers, merchants, and farmers. Notably, no peasants or truly poor people were among the Third's deputies. This was a revolution led by the bourgeois elite on behalf of all. Among the Third Estate deputies were figures who would soon gain fame: the modest lawyer Robespierre and the portly orator Mirabeau. Though born noble, he was elected for the Third Estate due to a grudge with his peers. Also the gifted scientist Abbé Sieyès and Jean-Sylvain Belly, an astronomer from Paris. So everything was all set up for a group of extraordinary talent. As they converged on Versailles in late April, the Third Estate deputies were painfully aware of their status. On May 4th, 1789, the day before the opening, a grand procession took place through Versailles. The contrast was stark. The nobles and clergy marched in their fine clothes, while, well, the Third Estate didn't have much fancy outfits. One witness, an English doctor, sniggered that the Third Estate deputies' attire was, quote, even worse than all of the inferior sort of gownsmen at English universities. Well, the Third Estate men walked in last in parade, literally behind the clergy and nobles, a visible symbol of their inferior status. To many of those representatives, this indignity encapsulated what was wrong with the old order. One deputy even muttered, "They treat us like dirt, even now." The next day, in the Great Hall, the king initially received only the nobility and clergy in the ornate Hall of Mirrors, delaying his greeting to the Third Estate in a less grand setting. These slights did not go unnoticed. I mean, it was pretty obvious what everyone was doing. It was as if, clinging to hierarchy at the very moment they pretended to listen to the nation, the court ensued the eruption of pent-up frustrations. Well, when the estate's general sessions began on May 5th, with the scene we visited in our opening, the unresolved question of voting immediately paralyzed progress. After the king's formal opening speeches, the estates were supposed to verify the credentials of their own members, but the Third Estate refused to do so. They were not going to do this separately from the other two. You see, they insisted that all deputies of all estates verify mandates in common as members of one national body. Now this was a direct challenge. The First and Second Estates, on the other hand, suspicious of being outnumbered, retreated to their own meeting halls and verified their roles alone, pointedly maintaining the separation of orders and us and them mentality. Days passed, and nothing got done. The king's ministers, and even Necker, gave no clear direction. A grave mistake. As one deputy noted, the speeches by the king and Necker had resulted in disappointment and frustration. No clear royal agenda was delivered. Mirabeau quipped that Necker's opening financial lecture contained, quote, "Not one principle, not one bold measure, only pompously uttered trivialities." There was no plan from above, so the initiative shifted below. Throughout May 1789, the Third Estate stood resolute. They would not commence official business until the estates sat together. Deadlocks deepened. Pleas and negotiations went nowhere. Finally, on the 10th of June, Sieyès rose and issued an invitation to the clergy and nobles. Come and join us, or we'll proceed alone. A few parish priests did go over in support. Then, on June 17, 1789, the Third Estate deputies took a bold step. By a decisive vote, they declared themselves the National Assembly. They asserted that, as the representatives of the majority of the nation, they had the right to act for France. Quote, from their resolution, said, "The Assembly declares that it is the National Assembly, that wherever its members are gathered, there is the National Assembly, and that no group of men can assume the power to prevent them from deliberating." End quote. Well, this was a revolutionary claim of sovereignty. Legally, it was an act of usurpation. They had no sanction from the king to do this, but they banked on popular support and the justice of their cause. In any way, the die was cast. Legitimacy was being redefined. And I suppose, basically, what was the king going to do about it? 3 days later came a scene of high drama that would be remembered for the ages. Finding their meeting hall closed by the king's guards, the deputies repaired to an indoor tennis court on June 20. There, in a sweltering, echoing arena, 576 deputies swore the tennis court oath, pledging not to separate, not to reassemble wherever circumstances require, until the constitution of the realm is established. It was a solemn collective vow, with one deputy after another signing their name. In Jacques Louis David's famous sketch of the moment, we see deputies of all three orders mingled together, arms outstretched in a shared sacred oath, a vision of national union in pursuit of a constitution. The king's authority had effectively been supplanted by the nation's will to embody its deputies. The fiery Mirabeau would soon tell a royal envoy, "We are here by the will of the people, and nothing but bayonets will drive us out." The legitimacy crisis had reached a breaking point, the Crown and the Commons standing eye to eye, each claiming to represent France. While politicians in Versailles argued about constitutions, tensions were boiling over in Paris itself. The common people of the capital, the wage earners, the market women, the artisans, and of course the unemployed, but they were facing economic hardship and food scarcity. By the summer of 1789, a loaf of bread, the staple of the diet, cost nearly a day's wages for many. Crowds in Paris followed the news from Versailles closely, cheering on the National Assembly. But they also grew anxious at the signs that the king might suppress this nascent reform by force. Now, indeed, through June and early July, Louis had been massing royal troops around Paris. This included foreign mercenaries, Swiss and German regiments considered to be more reliable to the crown than the native French soldiers. That ought to breed some resentment. Well, by July 11th, roughly half of the 25,000 soldiers encircling Paris were actually from foreign units. Their ominous presence fed rumors of an impending royal coup to shut down the National Assembly and somehow punish Paris for trying to overthrow the king. Of course, there was plenty of talk. It was on everybody's minds what was going to happen the next. The air was thick with conspiracy fears. On July 11th came the spark that set all of this ablaze. Under pressure from the hardline nobles in court, Louis XVI abruptly dismissed his finance minister, Jacques Necker, and banished him from the court. Necker was seen by the public as sympathetic to the cause of the Third Estate. His firing was widely interpreted as a signal that the king was turning against the reformers. News of his fall reached Paris on the following day, July 12th, and the response was explosive. Enraged and alarmed, huge crowds poured into the streets. Around 10,000 gathered at the Palais Royal Gardens alone. Speakers harangued the masses. One young journalist, Camille Desmoulins, famously leapt onto a table, pistol in hand, exhorting the crowd to take up arms and wear green ribbons to support the revolution. The atmosphere verged on insurrection, and over the next 2 days, Paris descended into complete chaos. Or, looked at another way, the people began to self-mobilize, depending on who you ask. The protesters clashed with cavalry units on July 12th, and the royal troops even opened fire on demonstrators in some areas, causing casualties. Rather than cowing the populace, it only made them angrier. Mobs attacked and burned several tax and customs posts, hated symbols of royal taxations on food and goods. Crowds raided storehouses and armories in search of food, guns, and ammunition. On July 13th, rumors spread that a monastery called Saint-Lazare was hoarding grain. An angry multitude broke in, and indeed they seized wagon loads of wheat and distributed it at the markets. The same day, people plundered many other sites holding arms or supplies. The authority of the old city government had evaporated, as the police and soldiers largely stood aside and did nothing to stop the spreading unrest. Alarmed at the city's breakdown of order, electors of Paris's districts, the men who had chosen the city's representatives to the Estates General, convened at the city hall and hastily formed a new standing committee to govern the city. They had also begun organizing a civilian militia, the seeds of what would become the National Guard of Paris. In any case, almost by the hour, power was shifting from royal authorities to the people. On the morning of July 14th, 1789, Paris was, as one account put it, in a state of alarm. An eyewitness wrote that the whole city appeared to be on the brink of a general revolt. By now, insurgents had seized thousands of muskets and even some cannons from a veterans' hospital and arsenal. But crucially, they still lacked gunpowder for their weapons. And that's when all eyes turned to the Bastille, the medieval fortress prison that loomed over the working-class district of Saint-Antoine. The Bastille's notorious reputation as a dungeon for enemies of the king made it another hated symbol, but more practically, it was rumored to hold a large store of gunpowder and cartridges. Mid-morning on July 14th, a large crowd of armed Parisians converged on the Bastille to demand these munitions, and the cannon be handed over. Well, nervous negotiations dragged on for hours between emissaries of the crowd and the Bastille's governor, Bernard René de Launay. But there was no resolution. Tension escalated under the summer sun. The crowd swelled into thousands. Finally, shortly after 1 p.m., fighting erupted. Accounts differ on who shot first. But in any case, the Battle of the Bastille had well and truly begun. For several ferocious hours, gunfire and cannon volleys tore back and forth. The besiegers, incensed and fearless, stormed the outer courtyard again and again. Some regular soldiers of the French guards defected and bought artillery to batter the fortress gates. I'm sure they would have been quite popular. Delaunay's outnumbered garrison of about 100 men was soon overwhelmed by the onslaught. By late afternoon, with casualties mounting on both sides and the fort's defences falling, Governor de Launay lost hope. Around 5:30 p.m., he ordered the great inner gates opened and surrendered rather than see a massacre. The victorious revolutionaries poured into the Bastille. They freed the few bewildered prisoners, who would have been quite happy to see them, and seized the coveted stores of gunpowder and arms. A new wave of triumphant fury swept the crowd. The hated Bastille had fallen. Its governor, de Launay, was dragged out and killed by a mob. Some accounts say he was stabbed to death. Others say they cut his head off. Either way, all roads lead to Rome, right? His severed head was paraded on a pike through the streets. Several of the fortress's guards met a similar fate, though about 100 survived as prisoners. The people of Paris paid a price in blood as well. Nearly 100 of their side were killed in the battle, and dozens more were wounded. But the outcome was undeniable, a once unthinkable victory. A monument of royal absolutism had been toppled by the people. The storming of the Bastille became the revolution's seminal flashpoint. In one day, the Parisian crowd had radically altered the course of history. News of the Bastille's fall spread rapidly, electrifying all of France. In the immediate aftermath, real political power in Paris shifted into the hands of these insurgents. The Standing Committee of Electors at City Hall reinvented itself as the Paris Commune city government. They appointed the scholarly astronomer Jean-Sylvain Bailly, who had led the tennis court oath, as a mayor of Paris, heading this revolutionary municipal government. The hastily formed citizen militia was officially recognized as the National Guard, with Marquis de Lafayette, a hero of the American War of Independence, chosen as its commander. On July 17th, King Louis XVI traveled to Paris, escorted by Lafayette's National Guards, and was greeted by Mayor Bailly at the City Hall. In a calculated show of goodwill, the king donned a tricolor cockade, a circular badge of red, white, and blue, which had become the symbol of the revolution, before a cheering crowd. By accepting this cockade and the authority of the new Paris officials, Louis appeared to concede that sovereignty of Paris, and indeed of France, now laid with the representatives of the people. The king even received the title Restorer of French Liberty, as if he personally were blessing the revolutionary changes. But this public reconciliation masked a very uncomfortable reality, and that was that events had outrun everyone's plans. Neither the king nor the moderate leaders of the assembly had intended or expected a violent urban uprising. Yet here we are, a revolution in the streets, fait accompli. The question now was not whether the old order would bend, but how far it would take for it to break. But the shockwave of the Bastille's fall did not just stop at Paris. In the ensuing weeks of July 1789, revolutionary fervour, and not to mention panic, spread across the countryside at astounding speed. A tumultuous wave of peasant unrest, known as the Great Fear, swept through the rural provinces from roughly the 20th of July to early August. The Great Fear was fueled by rumours, wild, frightening conspiracy theories that gripped village to village. The most common rumour claimed that bands of aristocrats or their agents were plotting a famine to destroy the harvest and starve the peasantry into submission. Other variations spoke of roving brigands or foreign mercenaries coming to burn down homes and crops. Now, these stories were patently false, but in the summer of 1789 they were widely believed by a peasantry already anxious from years of poor harvests, high prices, and, well, an uncertain future. Now, when news of Paris, insurrection, and the king's wavering response reached their hinterlands, it created both hope and fear among the common populace. Peasants were emboldened by reports that the people could defy the nobility, but they were also terrified that vengeful nobles or dismissed soldiers might strike their communities next. In late July, as rumours upon rumour spread along postal roads and market town gossip networks, many rural villages erupted into panic. Peasants hastily armed themselves with farm tools, muskets where they could get them, and makeshift weapons to defend against supposed brigands. In region after region, militias of villages assembled, ready to beat back the phantom menace. Well, significantly, The peasants began to turn against real local symbols of feudal authority. Bands of peasants attacked manor houses of the nobility and gentry, especially targeting the seigneurial chateaux that housed the records of feudal dues and rent obligations. In many cases, the goal was not to just murder the lords. Many landlords had already fled or hid somewhere, but rather to seize and destroy the documents that kept peasants largely bound to pay the ancient feudal fees. One popular slogan went, "This is how we punish the traitors." Grain storehouses were also raided on the suspicion that nobles were hoarding food. The Great Fear was essentially a social revolution from below, driven by a mix of panic and long-simmering resentment. Despite sensational reports at the time that hordes of peasants were indiscriminately burning aristocratic homes, the actual violence of the Great Fear was more restrained and perhaps strategic than the legend suggests. Later research showed that in most instances, villagers had simply compelled local lords to renounce their privileges or ransack the archives of feudal contracts, rather than committing wanton murder. In fact, fewer than 20 people are thought to have been killed in the Great Fear uprisings across all of France, which is a strikingly low fatality, given the given the scope of unrest, rather. The rural rebels' anger was largely focused on the feudal system itself, you see, not on indiscriminate bloodshed. But still, the psychological impact of the peasant insurrections was huge. The nobles who hadn't already emigrated were seized by dread at these peasant jacqueries. Landowners sent panicked letters to Versailles, describing anarchy in their provinces. In town after town, local authorities found themselves unable or perhaps sometimes unwilling to suppress the peasant actions. Just as the Parisian crowd had effectively claimed power in the capital, the countryside seemed to be slipping out of the control of the old authorities as well. For the National Assembly, which was still meeting at Versailles, the Great Fear presented both danger and opportunity. On one hand, the spreading rural violence threatened to tear France apart if nothing was done. The peasants might refuse to pay taxes or dues, and an all-out class war loomed. On the other hand, the deputies recognized that the peasants' grievances were the very injustices that the Assembly had pledged to address. Things like tithes to the church, unfair dues, feudal oppression, etc. The revolutionary deputies, many of them liberal aristocrats or middle-class landowners, now faced a choice. They were either to embrace the momentum from below and eliminate feudalism, or risk the revolution being torn asunder by an urban-rural division. The course they chose would become one of the revolution's defining moments. On the evening of August 4th, 1789, the National Constituent Assembly convened in an extraordinary session at Versailles. What followed was a whirlwind of generosity, panic idealism, and a bit of political theatre. A night often described as the death of the old regime. The session was initially called to address the disturbances in the provinces, i.e., what we just talked about, the Great Fear. A report on the alarming rural uprisings was read to the Assembly, confirming that the peasants were up in arms across the country. The atmosphere was tense. Clearly, something had to be done to quell the chaos. But few had predicted how far the Assembly would go that night. A group of liberal nobles in the Assembly seized the initiative. First, Viscount de Noailles, himself from one of France's most oldest noble families, took the floor. Acknowledging the peasant revolts, though technically criminal, were driven by unjust burdens of feudal oppression. Noailles astonished the Assembly by proposing the outright abolition of seigneurial privileges. The young noble declared that France stood at a crossroads between, quote, the complete destruction of society and a government which would be admired throughout Europe. The only way forward, he argued, was for the Assembly to prove that it stood with the people by dismantling the remnants of feudalism, eliminating corvée labor, seigneurial dues, and all the injustices that had provoked the peasants. As the other deputies sat in stunned silence, Noyer concluded that France must become a society of equal citizens, paying taxes only according to their means. No sooner had he finished than another aristocrat, Duc d'Aiguillon, one of the richest landowners in France, rose to a second and amplified the proposal. Aiguillon argued that, quite fervently so, that the Assembly could, quote, only prove its commitment to human rights by removing the remnants of the feudal barbarism under which the people had suffered. He urged all privileged classes to surrender their exclusive rights for the sake of the nation. Well, these speeches broke the dam. What followed was an outpouring of revolutionary zeal from members of the Assembly, like a moment of patriotic drunkenness, as one deputy described it later, Baron de Ferrier. One by one, noble deputies leapt to their feet to renounce the special privileges of the estates, provinces, cities, and corporations to which they belonged. The one Viscount de Varennes gave up the hunting rights and game preserves that nobles jealously guarded. The Bishop of Chartres declared that henceforth any peasant should have the right to kill game that was destroying his crops. Another nobleman denounced the humiliating practice of requiring peasants to perform feudal labor services, comparing it to yoking men like beasts, and he called for the full elimination of feudalism. Yet another suggested abolishing the tithe, the mandatory 10% tax paid to the church, which caused a collective gasp among the clergy and the attendants, I'm sure. Visibly caught up in enthusiasm, deputies cried out proposals for equality of taxation, equal punishment under the law, abolition of the sale of public offices, and an end to all remaining aristocratic exemptions. Some wept with joy as each new renunciation was made. In the hall, deputies embraced one another, and a spontaneous chorus of patriotic songs broke out. It was a festival of sacrifice, the old order of feudal privilege seemingly offering itself up at the altar of the nation. But not everybody was thrilled. A few conservative members were horrified. The Marquis de Lally-Tollendal passed a frantic note to a colleague that wrote, "They are not in their right minds. Adjourn the session." When that failed, Lally-Tollendal stood up and pleaded that they not forget the king in all of this. They suggested that Louis XVI be honored as the restorer of French liberty to sweeten the bitter pill for the monarchy. His intention did very little to stem the tide, but the Assembly did later insert a clause praising the king in the final decrees. By 2 a.m., in the early hours of August 5th, 19 sweeping articles had been drafted and approved in principle. Exhausted and exhilarated, the deputies finally adjourned. One commentator proclaimed that night that France was reborn, and the next morning people across France read the newspaper accounts of the August 4th session in astonishment and celebration. There was an outpouring of popular joy. Victory over privileges had been declared. A witness in Paris noted that even the unusually cynical commoners danced in the streets and embraced any nobles they saw wearing the tricolour cockade, hailing them as brothers. Of course, when dawn broke on August the 5th, the actual legal details of what had been done were still a little bit unclear. The Assembly had passed many motions in principle, but you had to formalize the text next. Over the next week, the deputies refined and codified the decrees. Some of the initial gestures proved to be too extreme or vague and had to be adjusted a little bit. Finally, on August 11th, 1789, the decrees of August 4th to 11th were promulgated, spelling out the abolition of the feudal system in France. Article 1 declared, "The National Assembly completely abolishes the feudal system." all forms of personal serfdom were abolished, without any compensation to lords. All other seigneurial dues were declared redeemable, mostly rents and payments in kind, meaning that peasants would eventually have to compensate landlords for their loss under terms set by the assembly. This compromise on redemption would later cause a bit of tension, but at least in theory, even those dues would not be permanent. The exclusive lordly rights that had vexed peasants for centuries were eliminated. The right of nobles to maintain pigeon houses, which caused peasants' crops to be eaten and noble pigeons, eaten by noble pigeons, they were gone too. All manorial courts, where lords had been judges over peasants, abolished. The tithe to the church was abolished without immediate compensation, with the understanding that the assembly would later provide for clerical salaries itself. Tax privileges of all sorts were abolished. Henceforth, everyone would pay taxes equally, in proportion to their means. Provincial and municipal privileges, special rights or autonomy held by certain regions or cities, very likewise abolished, in the name of one uniform law for all French citizens. Venal public offices, that is, jobs that one could buy and then pass on to heirs, were also eliminated. And in a bold statement of equality, one article proclaimed that all citizens of any birth are eligible for any office in the church, army, or state, and the only qualifications would be merit and talent. Taken together, the August decrees amounted to an incredible social revolution. In one stroke, the legal foundations of aristocratic privilege, the very background of the old feudal society, were swept away. Centuries-old distinctions between noble and commoner were erased, at least in theory. The old regime had died in a single night of legislative fervor. The assembly ordered that a solemn Te Deum, a hymn of thanks, be sung in churches, and that August 4th be commemorated each year as a festival of unity. France was reborn as a society of equals, freed from the shackles that had bound peasant to lord. Equally significant was why it happened so fast. The August 4th session was a direct response to the Great Fear. It was the Assembly's attempt to restore calm in the provinces by addressing the peasants' grievances. Fearful of ongoing chaos, and perhaps the peasants themselves, the nobles in the Assembly sacrificed their privileges in order to save their own lives and the revolution. Events on the ground had driven political changes at breakneck speed. What reformers might have contemplated doing over years happened in a single night, because the alternative seemed to be anarchy. While the abolition of feudalism also showed how idealism and pragmatism converged. Enlightenment-influenced deputies truly believed in human rights and legal equality, and here was a chance to enshrine those principles, spurred by urgent necessity. The August decrees destroyed the feudal regime, as their preamble put it, and paved the way for France to become a nation of citizens rather than lords and subjects. For King Louis XVI, however, this flood of change was nothing to celebrate. The Assembly sent the August decrees to the king for formal approval, as required to turn them into law. Now Louis, a staunch believer in his coronation oath to uphold France's traditional order, hesitated to sign. Privately, he was aghast at the renunciation of his nobles' rights. He wrote in a candid letter, "I will never consent to the despoliation of my clergy and my nobility. I will never give my sanction to such decrees." This hesitation would soon put the king on a collision course with the revolution's leaders on a new and even more fundamental issue, the definition of rights and citizenship in the new France. But even as they dismantled the old social order, the revolutionary leaders aimed to codify principles of their new one. In late August of 1789, the National Assembly turned to drafting a foundational statement of values for the coming Constitution. The result was the Declaration of the Rights of Man and the Citizen, adopted on August 26, 1789, a concise charter of Enlightenment ideals that would become the cornerstone of democratic movements worldwide. The Declaration was, in essence, the revolution's answer to the question, what do we stand for? The Declaration's opening lines echoed the American Declaration of Independence. It proclaimed that all men are born free and equal in rights. Social distinctions, it said, could be found only on the common good. It enshrined as natural and imprescriptible rights the classic triad of liberty, property, security, and resistance to oppression. In other words, the purpose of the government is to preserve those inherent rights of the individual. The Declaration called for the destruction of aristocratic privilege. It explicitly abolished the remnants of feudalism and unequal taxation, affirming freedom and equal rights for all men. It declared that sovereignty resides in the nation, not in a king by divine right. Quote from the text, "The principle of all sovereignty resides essentially in the nation. Nobody or individual may exercise authority that does not emanate expressly from the nation." This was a clear rejection of the monarchy's old justification. Law, as the Declaration stated, was to be an expression of the general will of the citizens, and all citizens have the right to contribute to the making of laws. It promised freedom of speech and the press, subject only to responsibility for abuses defined by law. It affirmed freedom of religion. Article X said, "No one may be disturbed for his opinions, even religious ones, provided that their manifestations does not trouble public order as established by law." It guaranteed basic due process in criminal law, no one to be arbitrarily arrested, and presumption of innocence for the accused. It insisted that laws and punishments apply equally to all, that taxation be appointed equally among all citizens, and that public officers and employments be open to talent rather than birth. The Declaration was a ringing endorsement of Enlightenment-era liberal ideals: equality before the law, individual liberty, the inviolability of private property, and popular sovereignty. Essentially, it distilled the aspirations of the revolution into 17 short articles. However, as high-minded as it was, the Declaration had critical limitations that reveal who the revolution's leaders imagined as the citizen. Notably, the rights and freedoms enumerated were explicitly the rights of man, and in practice this meant men only. Of course, when they say the rights of man, they mean humankind, but, well, women were not considered political equals in this document, I'm afraid. The Assembly drew a line between active and passive citizens. Only men over 25, who met a property threshold, i.e. paying taxes roughly equal to 3 days' labor, were deemed active citizens with the franchise and the right to hold public office. Now, that left out a majority of adult male Frenchmen, the very poor who paid no direct taxes, as well as all women, enslaved people, and foreigners. So in short, civic rights were conferred only on property-owning male citizens, perhaps about 4 million people in a nation of 26 million. Now this logic, shared by many Enlightenment thinkers, was that only those with a tangible stake in society and economic independence had the capacity for responsible political participation. Thus, while the Declaration proclaimed universal principles in theory, the new political system it envisioned was far from a universal suffrage or equality for all. Contemporary critics quickly pointed this out. Olympe de Gouges, a playwright and early feminist, was scandalized that half of humanity was excluded from universal rights. But this exclusion wasn't really overt. It was more just because women didn't pay taxes. It wasn't like it was written down in the actual document, "No girls allowed." In any case, in 1791 she penned the Declaration of the Rights of Women and the Female Citizen, mirroring the 17 Articles to argue that women should have equal rights, including the right to vote and hold office. Similarly, the Marquise de Condorcet, a Progressive Assembly member, pleaded that, quote, "He who votes against the rights of another, whether that be religion, color, or sex of that other, has abjured his own." But his calls extend to political rights of women went unheeded. He also wanted free black men in the colonies to have rights too, and people weren't too keen on that idea. So the French Revolution, in its first stage, did not lead to the recognition of women's political rights, but it was certainly a step. You have to start somewhere. Women who remained passive citizens, supposedly beneficiaries of the Declaration's protection in person and property, but they didn't really have a voice in making laws. Now, this showed that the Revolution's egalitarian rhetoric had a few boundaries. In any case, another omission was the issue of slavery. The Declaration made no mention of the enslaved population of France's Caribbean colonies, where nearly 500,000 people of African descent were held in bondage on sugar and coffee plantations. Despite agitation from abolitionists like Jacques-Pierre Brissot and the Society of the Friends of the Blacks, which they could have picked a better name for, but whatever, the Assembly did not extend the rights of man to enslaved people in 1789. Powerful lobbyists from the colonial planter class worked to block away any anti-slavery language. As a result, the Declaration's lofty affirmation that men are born and remain free and equal in rights was a bit of a contrast to all of those slaves in the French territories. But the hypocrisy was not lost on the enslaved themselves. The Declaration soon circulated in the French colony of Saint-Domingue, i.e. Haiti, sparking hope and unrest that would explode into the Haitian Revolution in 1791. We did a video about that. You can find it in the playlist. In any case, eventually, years later, the French Revolution would abolish slavery in 1794, only to have Napoleon restore it, and Haiti finally abolish it via independence in 1804. But in 1789, the rights of man were selectively applied. Now, despite its shortcomings, the Declaration of the Rights of Man and the Citizen was a landmark in the history of human rights, so we shouldn't cut it off at the knees. Like I said, everything has to be done in stages. Every ladder has to be climbed one rung at a time. It was a way to give the French Revolution a written manifesto of its ideals. It promised to French citizens equality under the law, representative government, and protection of fundamental liberties that no king could come in and infringe. The problem was it didn't solve France's urgent material problems. You see, bread was still expensive. The treasury was still empty. Nor did it resolve the contradictions of exclusion. But it provided a guiding star for the new society, and, well, the one that the revolutionaries had really needed to guide them to build this new way of life. In the words of the Declaration's second article, the aim of any political association was the preservation of the natural and imprescriptible rights of man. The old world of privilege was being dismantled, and in its place, the Assembly was attempting to erect a new world, this time based on reason, justice, and equality. The key now would be actually implementing these ideals, and that would prove to be harder and more perilous than many optimistic patriots had anticipated. So, by the early autumn of 1789, the revolution had altered France's power structure on paper. But there remained one big, unpredictable force. Was there somebody you forgot to ask? Still, we had to get out King Louis to sign that document. Now, the king had, for the most part, stayed at arm's length from Paris and the Assembly since July's upheavals. He resided in the regal Versailles, 12 miles from the capital, surrounded by courtiers and guarded by loyal, if uneasy, troops. Sure, they would have been feeling quite nervous after that day at the Bastille. Well, in Versailles, life continued on pretty much as normal, with all the aristocratic pageantry, even as decrees flew into the assembly hall and the people of France struggled with a poor grain harvest. Now, bread, of course, as we mentioned, remains scarce and expensive in Paris, and when people are hungry, they get very angry. I know I do. More so impatient, really. Anyway, rumor had it, right, and this is what everyone was talking about at the time. Everybody was saying that the royals at Versailles were feasting on the most luxurious of foods, quite obliviously to what was going on outside, and that they couldn't care less about the people outside starving. In fact, on October the 1st, 1789, an incident occurred that greatly inflamed popular opinion. The Royal Flanders Regiment had been brought to Versailles to reinforce the King's Guard. And guess what? They put on the most lavish of banquets, thrown by the King's bodyguard to welcome the officers. During this celebratory feast, held in the opulent opera house of the palace, the royal family, i.e. King Louis XVI, Queen Marie Antoinette, and the Dauphine, made a brief appearance. Toasts were drunk to their health, and according to press reports, royalist anthems played. Tales soon reached Paris of this, they called it an orgy of the aristocrats. Not literally, of course. Well, then again, who knows? The officers and ladies had contemptuously trampled the tricolour cockade of the Revolution, replacing it with the old white cockade of the Bourbon dynasty. Not really the kind of party games that they should have been having at this time. Now, whether it actually happened or not was exaggerated by the hostile newspapers, so it didn't really matter. The Parisians were already outraged. At a time when they were tightening their belts to afford a loaf of crummy old bread, the image of the decadent courtiers flaunting their contempt for the sacrifices of the nations, that was enough to clench fists. The October banquet scandal, combined with the continued high price of bread, created a volatile mood in Paris. Many believed that our problems won't be solved while the king and assembly sit off in Versailles isolated from the people, as one newspaper quoted. Unchecked rumors fanned the flames, of course. People said the king was entertaining counter-revolutionary plots with all the aristocrats, or even that Marie Antoinette was hoarding grain inside of Versailles. So, on the morning of October 5th, 1789, things got a little out of control. Well, the powder keg exploded, led this time by the often forgotten drivers of many revolutionary journeys, the women of Paris. You see, it began in the marketplaces of the city. A large group of market women, desperate over bread shortages, gathered at the Hôtel de Ville, City Hall that is, to demand action. These were the tough, working-class girls who daily toiled selling fish, produce, and other goods, not concerned about breaking a nail, that's for sure, not like the upper-class girls. Well, they had no patience for political delays when their families were hungry. That morning, a young woman banged a drum in the crowd, galvanizing others to join. The church bells of several districts rang out as a call to arms. A crowd of thousands, mostly women but including some men, formed up spontaneously. Many were armed with whatever they could find: kitchen knives, makeshift pikes, muskets, clubs. Eyewitnesses recall women shoving their way into the city hall, soaking wet from the pouring rain, determined to find bread and, quote, the baker, a popular moniker for the king who was said to be responsible for feeding the people. Well, at first, their target was the city government for failing to secure grain. But soon a new cry arose: to Versailles. The idea took hold that they should march to the king's palace at Versailles and bring their grievances directly to Louis XVI. This notion had begun circulating among agitators for weeks. Even Mirabeau had suggested that bringing the king to Paris would make him heed the people's voice. Now the women of Paris were going to do it themselves, and they weren't going to take an appointment. Thus began the historic Women's March on Versailles. The same afternoon of October 5th, a column of Parisian women, perhaps 6,000 to 7,000 strong, I know, right, 6, 7, set out on the 12-mile trek to Versailles in pouring rain. They tramped through mud, dragging cannon and wagons, chanting for bread, sometimes even threatening to kill Marie Antoinette, whom they blamed for many woes, nicknaming her Madame Deficit. National Guardsmen from Paris, who had initially tried to stop the women from leaving, ended up joining the march. The rank-and-file guards were hungry, and they were discontented too. They also idolized the concept of the nation. When some agitators urged the guards to follow the women to Versailles, with cries that the soldiers who stayed behind were not patriots, the troops nearly mutinied. General Lafayette himself, commander of the National Guard, found he couldn't restrain the men. To prevent disorderly desertion, Lafayette decided to lead them to Versailles in an orderly fashion later that day. So a second column of roughly 15,000 armed National Guards headed to Versailles in the evening, several hours behind the women. As dusk fell on October 5th, the women's vanguard reached Versailles. Drenched and exhausted, they nonetheless boldly entered the hall of the assembly, interrupting the deputies' proceedings with their cries for food. A group of the market women were escorted to meet King Louis XVI himself that evening. They reportedly begged him, "Come back to Paris, sire, and be our father and provider. We have no bread." The king sympathetically agreed to order some grain released for Paris, and after some hesitation even signed the August decrees and the Declaration of Rights, a major concession. Likely he felt he had very little choice at this point. By the early hours of October 6, it seemed a peaceful resolution was at hand. Lafayette arrived with the National Guard and assured the king that order could be maintained. Louis appeared on a balcony and received cheers when he announced he would distribute bread. But events took a darker turn at the dawn of October 6th. Some of the more militant marchers, frustrated and suspicious, penetrated the palace before sunrise, supposedly intent on finding Queen Marie Antoinette, whom at this point was universally loathed. In a chaotic clash, a mob broke into the royal apartments. The queen barely escaped through a secret passage from her bedroom as intruders burst in, slashing at her bed. Two of the royal bodyguards, the king's guards who had angered the mob at the banquet, were killed by the crowd. Their severed heads were later stuck on pikes. Violence hung in the air. Lafayette and his guards managed to eventually secure the palace and calm the crowd. Lafayette famously kissed the queen's hand on the balcony as a gesture to quell the mob's anger, an act both gallant and pragmatic. The crowd, now tens of thousands strong, including the guard, by the way, began chanting, "The King to Paris." A message was clear. The royal family must relocate to Paris with the people, where they could be watched and made to answer to the nation. Given the intensity of the situation, Louis submitted. He announced that he would return to Paris, taking his wife and children as well. So in the early afternoon of October 6th, a strange procession left Versailles for the capital. At the head were women carrying loaves of bread on pikes, bread taken from the palace stores that they imagined they were bringing back to Paris. Behind came wagons loaded with flour from the royal grain reserves, and then, surrounded by Lafayette's National Guards and swarms of joyous and armed citizens, came the carriage carrying King Louis, Queen Marie Antoinette, and their children. The women shouted triumphantly, "We are bringing back the baker, the baker's wife, and the baker's boy." It was a mix of good-humored sarcasm and genuine menace. What it symbolized, however, was unmistakable. The monarchy was now firmly in the hands of the people. As the crowd escorted the royal family to Paris that evening, they were effectively prisoners. Though treated with a bit of ceremony, they were prisoners nonetheless. The king took up residence in the Tuileries Palace in the heart of Paris, under the protection of the people. But in the weeks that followed, the National Assembly moved its deliberations to Paris as well. Most deputies relocated to continue their work in the capital, where they could be closer to and under the watch of the populace. The October days of 1789 marked the irrevocable collapse of royal authorities. One chronicler observed, "These events ended the king's independence and heralded a new balance of power, displacing the privileged orders in favor of the common people." Indeed, never again would Louis XVI enjoy freedom of action as a sovereign ruler. He was now, as some termed it, the baker of Paris, expected to govern in line with the revolution's demand or, well, face dire consequence. The common people had proven their ability to directly shape the course of the revolution. They had literally brought the king to heel. The revolution had won an immense symbolic victory. Royal authority was not destroyed, but it was now subordinate to the will of the people in a very real sense. But at the same time, a foreboding sense lingered. A delegate, upon seeing the royal family brought to Paris, remarked, "The revolution has won something huge, but now must contend with ruling." The monarchy was cornered, not abolished. Louis XVI outwardly accepted the tricolour cockade and the new order, but his true feelings were far from calm. The Queen, Marie Antoinette, was livid and heartbroken at their humiliation. She and the king began to secretly plot ways to undermine or escape the situation almost immediately. The moderate revolutionaries like Lafayette believed they could bridle the monarchy into a constitutional framework. But the more radical voices in Paris were already skeptical. So, the question was, did the king's compliance in Paris signify a lasting cooperation, or merely a tactical retreat? By the end of 1789, the French Revolution had achieved some pretty astonishing victories, and these victories came within a matter of months, unheard of in any other revolution. Absolute monarchy had effectively been tamed. The king was no longer an unchallenged sovereign, but he was basically a virtual hostage legislator in Paris. The feudal aristocracy had been stripped of its legal privileges. Centuries of feudal rights and class exemptions were abolished overnight. A bold statement of human rights and national sovereignty had been proclaimed to the world. Power had flowed into new institutions, you see. The National Assembly, the Paris Commune, the National Guard. It was all in the name of the people. A contemporary might well have thought that the revolution was, well, mission accomplished. All of the aims were fulfilled, or pretty much so. On November 2nd, 1789, the Assembly even seized all church lands for the nation, striking a blow to the wealth of the clergy. It truly seemed to be a new dawn. Bailly, Lafayette, and other moderates busied themselves organizing the new government, hoping to stabilize France under a constitutional monarchy, and one where the king and the assembly would finally collaborate on more equal terms. And yet, beneath the surface, many enormous challenges loomed. The very speed of events had to outrun stability. A power vacuum now existed at the heart of French governance. Who would ultimately shape policy? Who would ultimately enforce order? Who has those rights? The king, though constrained, still held nominal executive power and commanded quite a bit of loyalty, but he was deeply unreconciled to many changes and secretly sought to reverse them. The only reason why he signed documents in the first place was because he was surrounded. The assembly held legislative authority and boasted eloquent leaders, but it was also riven by factionalism, monarchists versus patriots, conservatives versus Democrats. They'd yet to face the test of implementing their ideals in practice. The common people of Paris, the sans-culottes, the market women, the revolutionary clubs, they had discovered their own strengths in the journeys of July and October. Would they be content to step back and now trust the bourgeois assembly to deliver bread and liberty to them all? Or would they push the revolution further on the streets if their expectations were not met? Out in the provinces, many peasants were rightly satisfied by the abolition of feudal dues, but others were weary of the fine print. Those redeemable rents might come back to cheat them. In some areas, unrest was still flickering. The Catholic Church, stripped of its tithes and its lands, was on a collision course with revolutionaries over reforms to come. The devout French peasantry, well, they might not approve of the everything that the assembly did to the church. And beyond France's borders, the aristocrats who had fled, such as the king's reactionary brother, the Count of Artois, were lobbying foreign monarchs to intervene and crush the revolution. Kings and nobles across Europe were eagerly watching events in France with a mix of alarm and horror, dreading the spread of these radical ideals. Quietly, Austria and Prussia and others began to consider how to respond to the overthrow of traditional order in a major European power. So in short, the revolution had won power, but now it had to govern amidst this turmoil. Marquis de Ferrières wrote in late 1789, "The revolution now has to face its enemies both within and without." And that was true. Inside France, some still dreamed of undoing the work of 1789. Royalist nobles, refractory clergy, and others who had lost their privilege were really pining for the old days. Outside, émigré nobles like Artois openly vowed to raise armies and restore the king. Louis XVI himself, though he played the part of the constitutional monarch for now, was a prisoner of events, harboring hopes that fortune or foreign help might free him from the national yoke. As one observer shrewdly noted, the king returned to Paris amid acclamation, but it was a highly equivocal vote of confidence. The people cheered Louis because they believed he had a hand in the revolution and had accepted it. But if he betrayed it, those same people could just as easily turn on him with quite a vengeance. Thus, 1789 ended not with a tidy resolution, but with a dramatic cliffhanger again. The Ancien Régime was effectively vanquished, and the revolutionaries stood in charge of the destiny of a new France. Yet the very victory of the revolution created a new and uncertain world, one that people weren't sure how to navigate. A profound power vacuum lay where the absolute monarchy and feudal system had been, and somebody had to rush in and fill that. So who would it be? The moderate constitutionalists like Lafayette and Bailey steering a middle course, the radical Democrats and sans-culottes pushing for deeper equality, maybe even the king himself plotting a comeback, or even foreign armies intervening to restore order. The coming months and years would test whether the ideals of 1789 could endure the trials of governance and war. Now let's continue from where we left off. We have a core question today, and that is, why did the French Revolution radicalize? And how exactly did it end up with these strongmen characters? We're going to see how war, distrust, and a bit of uncompromising moral certainty turned these ideals into coercive policies, and ultimately how that paved the way for Napoleon's rise to power, which, yes, a series about that coming up soon. So let's get straight into it. Well, let's set the scene. We're going to jump forward a little bit. Paris, early September 1792. The city's gutters are literally running red with blood. A mob of sans-culottes has stormed the prisons, dragging out the enemies of the people. You've got refractory priests, nobles, common criminals, kicking and screaming. The common people subject them to gruesome vigilante trials. Those who were found guilty were released, only to be hacked to pieces by the waiting crowds, their bodies heaped up in gruesome piles. Over 4 days, about 1,200 prisoners were massacred in what came to be known as the September Massacres. Pretty shocking. It was later called the First Terror of the Revolution, and it horrified observers at home and abroad, though the ones at home were probably a little bit too nervous to speak out about it too loudly. This is a far cry from the hopeful days we discussed in our first video, those days of 1789, all the optimism, the revolution that had proclaimed liberty, equality, and fraternity, now has its hands covered in blood. So today's video is all about how did we get here? And to answer that, let's rewind a little bit. It is June 1791. The uneasy partnership between King Louis XVI and the Revolution was irreparably shattered. On the night of the 20th to the 21st of June 1791, Louis XVI, Queen Marie Antoinette, and their children attempted to flee Paris in disguise, hoping to reach royalist strongholds on the frontier. This flight to Varennes ended in complete failure. The royal family was recognized and arrested in the town of Varennes, and then escorted back to Paris. The attempt to escape destroyed the illusion that Louis had accepted the revolution, proving to the public that the king could no longer be trusted. Despite the National Assembly's desperate cover story, they pretended the king had been kidnapped in order to save the still unfinished constitution. The truth was plain for everyone to see. Parisians lined the streets in sullen silence as their now citizen king was brought back under guard. The silence enforced by General Lafayette's posted warnings that whoever applauds the king shall be flogged, whoever insults him will be hanged. The people felt betrayed. Hidden in the royal carriage were documents in which Louis denounced the revolution's reforms, confirming many of the citizens' worst fears. One observer summed up the political sentiment quite bitterly. We wanted to trust him. He never wanted us. The flight to Varennes was a pivotal turning point. It drastically increased the public's hatred and distrust for the monarchy, pushing many to consider for the first time that France might be better off without them. turn the whole place into a republic. Until then, outright republicanism had been a pretty fringe idea. But now even moderate revolutionaries began to conclude that the king's loyalty was a complete sham. As the historian Thomas Carlyle later put it, Varennes was the second death of the king, his sacred aura gone. Indeed, by July 1791, calls for his abdication swept Paris. On the 17th of July of that same year, a large crowd gathered on the Champ de Mars to sign a petition demanding the king's removal and a national referendum on establishing a republic. The result was a tragic clash. Lafayette's National Guard, under orders to disperse the demonstrators, opened fire on the crowd. Dozens were killed in the Champ de Mars massacre, and the revolutionary family was now bitterly split in two. The moderate leaders, the Feuillants, a faction including Lafayette, lost credibility for shooting civilians. It's probably the best way to lose credibility, I'd say. While radicals like Georges Danton and Maximilien Robespierre went into hiding or denounced the violence. Any remaining trust between the people and the crown, or between the moderate and radical revolutionaries, lay in complete ruins. The constitutional monarchy experiment was fatally undermined. From this point forward, the revolution would hurtle toward republicanism and radicalization, driven by fear that traitors lurked around every corner. Well, by 1792, the revolution faced a new and existential threat, and that is war with the crowned heads of Europe. In April of 1792, hardline revolutionaries, the Girondins in the Assembly led by Jacques Brissot, pushed France to declare war on Austria, hoping to rally the nation and spread revolutionary ideals abroad. Initially, war fever swept the streets. Volunteers in plumed hats sang the Marseillaise as they marched off to war. But things quickly went wrong. French armies, disorganized and riddled with treasonous aristocratic officers, suffered defeats and even desertions. Prussia joined the fight against France, and by summer enemy troops were advancing toward the French frontier. As the foreign threat grew, so did panic and paranoia in Paris. Ordinary citizens feared invasion and treachery from within. Enemies everywhere became the mindset of the day. Nothing inflamed the sense of mortal danger more than the Brunswick Manifesto of July of 1792. Now, on the 25th of July, Duke Charles of Brunswick, commander of the Austro-Prussian forces, issued a proclamation threatening to destroy Paris if any harm befell King Louis XVI and his family. Intended to intimidate, this ultimatum had the opposite effect. It just enraged the French public. To Parisians, Brunswick's threats were seen as proof of the king's collusion with foreign invaders. And indeed, Louis and Marie Antoinette had secretly approved Brunswick's manifesto beforehand. The manifesto, quote, sent the populace into furious action. Rather than cowing Paris, it sparked an uprising, according to writers of the time. Now, on the 10th of August, 1792, the revolutionaries struck first. A mass insurrection in Paris stormed the Tuileries Palace, the royal residence, and in a bloody battle, hundreds of Swiss guards loyal to the king were killed defending the palace. The mob massacred many who surrendered. The monarchy was effectively overthrown. Louis XVI took refuge with the Assembly, but was soon arrested and imprisoned. This August 10th insurrection was a pivotal victory for radical forces, accomplished under the rallying cry of saving the revolution from internal enemies and foreign tyrants. After August 1792, paranoia was the real policy. The Legislative Assembly, soon to be succeeded by a newly elected National Convention, suspended the king and abolished the monarchy, all in the name of national salvation. A revolutionary commune in Paris, led by extremists like Georges Danton and Jean-Paul Marat, gained de facto power and pressed the Assembly to adopt emergency measures. It was in this fevered atmosphere, as Prussian armies marched into France and royalist conspiracies were suspected at every turn, that ordinary citizens took the law into their own hands, perpetuating the September massacre described at the chapter's opening that we talked about. Now, fear and fury drove the revolution to a new phase. Revolutionary self-preservation, at any cost. The logic was thus: France was under siege, so anyone not for the revolution must be against it. In the words of one deputy, let terror be the order of the day. Liberty would have to be suspended for a little while, at least until we would secure the Republic's survival. In September of 1792, France declared itself a republic, but unity was not quite there yet. With the monarchy gone, new splits emerged among the revolutionaries themselves. The elected National Convention was bitterly divided from the outset, essentially into two main blocks: the Girondins, Brissot and allies of the provinces, versus the Montagnards, Robespierre, Danton, Marat, and the Parisian deputies of the radical Jacobins. This Girondin-Montagnard conflict was a clash of both ideology and personality. The Girondins were ardent revolutionaries, but mistrusted the militant Paris mobs, and championed provincial autonomy and economic liberalism. The Montagnards, by contrast, allied themselves with the sans-culottes of Paris, and were bolder in their response to the Parisian problems, willing to enact extreme state controls in the name of revolutionary necessity. Well, as one Jacobin leader, Saint-Just, famously declared, "No freedom for the enemies of freedom." To the Montagnards, safeguarding the revolution might require suspending individual liberties, whereas Girondins feared the revolution was becoming a new kind of tyranny. These factions first collided over the fate of the king. The ousted monarch, now simply called Citizen Louis Capet, was on trial in December 1792 for treason. The Montagnards argued that Louis's guilt was a foregone conclusion. After all, he'd betrayed France by conspiring with the enemy, and they pushed for his execution to cement the Republic. The Girondins generally favored sparing his life, or at least delaying punishment, fearing that executing the king might spur more conflict at home and abroad. In the end, after an intense debate, the convention voted for death by a narrow margin, 380 votes to 310. Louis XVI was condemned, and on 21st of January 1793, he was guillotined in Paris's Place de la Révolution. The king met his end with dignity, though. Observers noted his composed final words. But his death sent shockwaves through Europe. It also deepened the rift in the convention. The Girondins, who had tried to save Louis, were now painted by extremists as secret royalist sympathizers. The revolution had crossed a point of no return with regicide, and moderation increasingly looked like treason. The pressures of the war only exacerbated the internal feuds. In the spring of 1793, as French army suffered new defeats, and enemy forces pressed toward the frontiers, Paris grew more radical. Food shortages and inflation were causing misery. Royalist uprisings were flaring in the provinces, as we'll get to in a minute. The sans-culottes and their Jacobin allies demanded strong action now. They accused the Girondins, who criticized the violent excesses of the Paris Commune and opposed price controls, of undermining the revolution from within. In May of 1793, the conflict came to a head. Parisian militants, encouraged by Montagnards, staged an armed uprising on the 31st of May to the 2nd of June, surrounding the convention and demanding an expulsion of the Girondin leaders. Yielding to force, the convention arrested 29 Girondin deputies and 2 of their ministers, effectively purging the Girondin faction from power. This was a decisive coup by the radical revolutionaries, and it left the Montagnards and their sans-culotte allies in dominance, firmly under Jacobin control. The revolution, in effect, turned on itself. Those who once led 1789's liberal revolution were now either dead, in prison, on the run, or condemned as traitors to the people. With the Girondins gone, the Jacobins in the convention moved swiftly to implement an unprecedented regime of emergency measures. France's survival seemed to hang by a thread in mid-1793. Foreign invaders in the northeast, royalist civil war in the west, economic collapse looming and the cries of starvation in the cities. In response, the revolutionary government took on extraordinary powers, many of which blurred or broke the ideals of 1789 in the name of saving them. And it's here where the reign of terror truly took off. By September 1793, terror had been officially enshrined as government policy. The convention, now controlled by the Montagnards, declared that terror is the order of the day, signaling that state violence and coercion would be used systematically to defeat the enemies of the revolution. So what does that mean in practice? Basically constructing a quasi-dictatorial regime, wielding extraordinary powers, all justified as temporary measures for public safety. Pretty much martial law, this kind of thing. Over the latter half of 1793, a series of laws and institutions gave the revolutionaries unprecedented control over French society. First was the Revolutionary Tribunal. As early as 1793, in the month of March, the convention established a special court in Paris to try political offenders, if that be spies, traitors, or counter-revolutionaries. This revolutionary tribunal had no jury, at least not in the modern sense, and no appeal, and by law it could return only one of 2 verdicts, either acquittal or death. Trials were limited to 3 days at most, and as the terror wore on, acquittals became increasingly rare. The tribunal would send thousands to the guillotine in Paris, including ultimately some of the revolution's own former leaders. We'll get to that a little bit later. Next was the surveillance committees. In every locality, the convention decreed the formation of local committees of surveillance, charged with unmasking and arresting suspects. These neighborhood-level watchdogs encouraged citizens to denounce anyone with counter-revolutionary leanings. The definition of a suspect, well, that was deliberately vague. Under the broad law of suspects of 17th of September 1793, any person who, by their conduct, associations, remarks, or writings, showed themselves hostile to liberty or supportive of tyranny could be arrested and imprisoned without trial. In practice, this ambiguous net could ensnare almost anyone. Nobles, ex-officials, suspect priests, hoarders of goods, or simply those who failed to show enthusiastic support for the revolution. Neighbor turned against neighbor. The atmosphere was pervasive of distrust. To coordinate it all, the convention had earlier, April 1793, created a small executive body, the Committee of Public Safety, which by summer 1793 became the de facto war cabinet and supreme authority in France. Consisting of 12 members, including Robespierre, Saint-Just, Couthon, and other Jacobins, the CPS was ostensibly subject to the convention, but in reality eclipsed it in power. In October 1793, the convention formalized the CPS's dominance by declaring the government revolutionary until the peace, essentially suspending the 1793 democratic constitution and giving the committee full executive powers. The CPS directed all military, economic, and police matters, centralizing authority to an unprecedented degree. It became a 12-man collective dictatorship, intent on waging total war, both against foreign armies and against internal enemies. Bowing to sans-culotte demands, the government imposed strict economic diktats to address shortages and inflation. On the 29th of September, the law of the general maximum was passed, which fixed price ceilings on essential goods like grain, bread, fuel, etc., and wages. Merchants were required to sell at mandated prices. Hoarders and profiteers would face revolutionary tribunals. These price controls were meant to ensure affordable bread prices for the poor, a key sans-culotte concern. While it somewhat relieved urban hunger, it also fueled a black market and rural resentment. Nonetheless, the policy reflected the government's willingness to override free market principles in the name of the people's welfare. Well, perhaps the most radical measure was the lève en masse. It's the mass conscriptions decreed on the 23rd of August 1793. Every unmarried, able-bodied man between 18 and 25 was conscripted for military service, an unprecedented mass draft aiming to throw the nation's full weight against the invaders. This was essentially history's first instance of total war mobilization. Despite instances of draft dodging, the lève en masse swelled France's armies to around 750,000 men within a year, dwarfing the forces of the old regime. The People's Army turned the tide of the war. By 1794, the Republic's armies were on the offensive, but it also meant virtually every family was directly touched by the war effort. The lève en masse exemplified the revolution's military zeal, the idea that citizens owe everything, even their lives, to the patria in danger. It also had a darker underside. Resistance to conscription, especially in conservative rural areas, helped ignite deadly civil strife, most notably in the Vendée, which we'll discuss later. All these extraordinary measures amounted to a controlled revolution, a wartime dictatorship draped in revolutionary ideals. The government's rallying justification was that these sacrifices of liberty were temporary, but ultimately they were completely necessary. It was one of those situations where it just had to be done. And, well, no one was really questioning it with those tribunals looming. As CPS member Saint-Just phrased it, until the peace, the government will remain revolutionary. The new Jacobin Constitution of 1793, which promised universal male suffrage and social rights, was cynically put on hold, placed in a cedar chest to be brought out when the time is right. For now, survival would trump liberty. Robespierre articulated the guiding philosophy. If the mainspring of popular government in peacetime is virtue, the mainspring of popular government during a revolution is virtue and terror combined. Virtue without terror is fatal. Terror without virtue is impotent. In other words, terror, ruthless justice, was seen as an instrument of virtue to protect the revolution's ideals from its enemies. Under this rationale, the reign of terror unleashed by the Committee of Public Safety went into full swing by 1793. Surveillance became a civic duty. Trials of suspects became assembly line levels of efficient. And the guillotine's blade was seldom dry. The period from roughly 1793 to July of 1794 saw an unprecedented state of bloodshed. An estimated 16,000 people were officially executed by revolutionary courts, and another 10,000 plus died in prison or without trial. As the terror engulfed both Paris and the provinces, the total death toll is usually given between 30 and 50,000. And who were those victims? Well, while nobles and ex-royalists were among the first targets, i.e. Queen Marie Antoinette herself went to the guillotine on 16th of October 1793, which we did a full video about Marie Antoinette. If you want to go and look at that, you'll find it in the playlist somewhere. The terror eventually did devour people from all walks of life. Former revolutionary leaders were not spared. Girondin politicians like Brissot and Madame Roland were executed in the autumn of 1793. So were one-time constitutional monarchists like Banave and even Paris's ex-mayor Bailly, ironically guillotined on the Champ de Mars, where he had ordered the massacre 2 years prior. Commoners, too, fell victim in great numbers, often on flimsy denunciations or for minor infractions. A grocer who sold underweight bread, a peasant who said a kind word about the king, or even a certain Olympe de Gouges, a famous playwright of the Declaration of the Rights of Women, was guillotined for allegedly supporting the wrong faction. The terror meant to eliminate enemies of liberty. In practice, it just cast an ever-widening net. By early 1794, the revolution was eating its own children at an alarming rate. Robespierre and his inner circle on the committee saw enemies to left and right. The ultra-radical Herbertists, followers of Jacques Hébert, who wanted more de-Christianization and terror, were arrested and executed in March of 1794 because Robespierre felt that their extremism and the atheist cult of reason threatened the Republic. Immediately afterwards, Robespierre turned on the moderate Dantonists, the so-called indulgents like Georges Danton and Camille Desmoulins, who had been urging an easing of the terror and peace negotiations. Danton and Desmoulins were popular heroes of 1789 and 92, but that did not save them. They were guillotined on the 5th of April, 1794, condemned as traitors who wanted to spare the guilty and betray the revolution. As spring 1794 went on, the terror intensified. The notorious law of 22 Prairial, as the 10th of June 1794, virtually abolished defense rights for trial and sent the guillotine into overdrive, inaugurating the so-called Great Terror. In June to July of 1794, executions in Paris spiked dramatically, hundreds per week under this streamlined process, until even members of the convention felt that nobody was safe from the tribunals of Robespierre. But even as the guillotine man worked overtime in Paris, the revolution's harshest violence often unfolded in the provinces, which tends to get ignored in this story. Sometimes when people talk about the revolution, they always talk about it in the city, Out in the countryside, armed counter-revolutionary uprisings met brutal repression. The most destructive of these was the War in the Vendée, a massive civil war that raged in western France. Beginning in March of 1793, the Vendée uprising was a popular revolt against the revolution's policies, fueled by royalist and Catholic sentiment. The Vendée was a devout, rural region, and they'd never really been too keen about the revolution. It reached a breaking point when the convention's conscription order of February 1793, a levée masse of 300,000, arrived. Peasants took up arms, and alongside local nobles and refracted priests, rallied under the cry of "Long live the King and the Church." The revolutionaries aren't going to like that one, that's for sure. By mid-March 1793, tens of thousands of Vendéens were in open revolt, seizing towns and defeating Republican National Guard units. They formed a Catholic Royal Army. This insurrection coincided with other anti-Jacobin revolts in Lyon, Marseille, Bordeaux, and Normandy, coming at a perilous moment when France was losing on the front, defeat at Neerwinden, 18th of March 1793. So, in other words, France's revolution was under mortal threat from within, just as it was from without. A rock and a hard place, that's for sure. The convention reacted to these internal rebellions with uncompromising force. They were not going to take this threat lying down. Throughout 1793 and into 1794, revolutionary armies and representatives on mission, deputies sent with dictatorial powers to the provinces, waged a war of no mercy to stamp out the counter-revolution. In the Vendée, the conflict was characterized by atrocities on both sides. Rebel Vendeans committed massacres of republicans, including an infamous slaughter of prisoners at Machecoul in March of 1793, while Republican forces, they responded in kind. Key Vendean strongholds like Saumur and Angers seesawed in fierce fighting. Eventually, by the fall of 1793, the tide had turned. Republican generals such as Jean-Baptiste Clerve and François Westermann crushed the main Vendean army at Cholet, 17th of October, 1793, and by December, the remnants of the rebel army were cornered and annihilated at Le Mans and Savenay. These battles were savage. At Le Mans, for example, perhaps 15,000 Vendean rebels were killed, including many women and children accompanying the rebel force, not only in combat, but also in the massacres of prisoners that followed. The language of the Republicans was one of extermination. One general even wrote, "The Vendée no longer exists." After defeating the main forces, the Republican government undertook what has been called the Infernal Columns Campaign, early in 1794. General Louis-Marie Turreau led columns of troops on search and destroy missions throughout the Vendean countryside. Villages were torched. Civilians suspected of royalist sympathy were slaughtered. And the goal was to leave not a trace of that rebellious land. These severe reprisals provoked further guerrilla resistance and have led some historians to label the Vendée repression as genocidal. Now, whether or not one is going to use that term, I think it's probably fair to use it. The reality is that tens of thousands of people, perhaps up to 200,000, perished in the Vendée through the war, massacre, famine, and disease. The violence escalated in a horrific feedback loop. Each atrocity by rebels or Republicans fueled the next, erasing limits. Similar patterns occurred elsewhere. For example, Lyon, a hotbed of the Girondin-led Federalist revolt against Paris, was retaken by Republican forces, who then carried out mass executions, including tying prisoners in front of cannons or sinking boatloads of them into the Rhône. Over in Nantes, the envoy Jean-Baptiste Carrier infamously organized mass noyades, the drownings of hundreds of suspected royalists by sinking barges on the Loire. Such was the ferocity of the terror in the provinces. But why did the revolution's violence escalate to such extremes? A key reason is that the revolutionaries believed the very survival of the Republic was at stake, and thus any means were justified against internal enemies. The Vendée and other revolts strengthened the notion that the Republic was under attack from within, that France's most dangerous enemies were actually the French people themselves. To the men in the Committee of Public Safety, leniency towards rebels equated to betraying the revolution's defenders, and they were dying on the front lines. As Robespierre would urge, mercy to the guilty is cruelty to the innocent. So in this atmosphere, all the normal restraints collapsed. The moral certainty of the radical revolutionaries, convinced they fought for virtue and the future of humanity, combined with fear and hatred to produce coercion and bloodshed on an unprecedented scale. Perhaps France had not seen so much blood spilled since possibly not since Julius Caesar had invaded them. Now, war, civil war, and terror fed upon each other. By 1794, France had largely defeated its foreign and domestic foes, yet the logic of suspicion kept on, in part because those wielding power feared to stop, knowing they themselves could be accused next. This cycle could not sustain itself indefinitely. It was only a matter of time before the revolution's fervor burned even its brightest torchbearer. On the 27th of July, 1794, the terror finally consumed its foremost architect, Maximilien Robespierre. Funny how the chickens come home to roost. Fearing that they may be the next victims, a coalition of convention deputies turned on Robespierre and his followers. Excuse me. In a dramatic session, Robespierre was shouted down and arrested. The next day, he and 21 of his closest allies, including Saint-Just and Georges Couthon, were sent to the guillotine. They didn't even get a trial, which is kind of ironic because they were the ones who were pushing for people not to have trials. You know what I mean. It was the final spasm of the terror claiming its own leaders. Robespierre's execution marked the culmination of the revolution's self-devourment. The man who had come to personify uncompromising revolutionary virtue himself died as a vilified tyrant amid the cheers of those who once acclaimed him. This was the famous Thermidorian reaction, essentially a backlash against radical terror and a lurch back toward moderation. Thermidor, the month in the revolutionary calendar, became synonymous with revenge against the Jacobins. In the weeks and months after Robespierre's fall, the remaining convention members dismantled the machinery of terror. The law of 22 Prairial was repealed. The law of suspects was relaxed and eventually abolished, and thousands of prisoners were released. The dreaded Paris Revolutionary Tribunal was reorganized and then gradually wound down. The Jacobin Club in Paris, the power base of the Montagnards, was shut down, its members prosecuted. Many radical Jacobins were attacked or even killed in what is seen as what is rather called the White Terror of 1795. Young royalist thugs beat to death former terrorists in the street as retribution. In short, France had recoiled from extreme policies, the ones that had defined the prior year. Basically, it was the end of the terror and Jacobin dominance. But, hold your horses, Thermidor was not exactly a return to idealistic normalcy, but rather the exhaustion of idealism. The men who overthrew Robespierre were mostly his colleagues, and ones on the committees and the conventions, plain centre faction. They acted less out of ideological conversion than out of fatigue and fear. Years of moral absolutism and bloodshed that had all bred deep weariness. As the Thermidorians took charge, they rejected Robespierre's intense republic of virtue. No more would France try to enforce utopia by the sword. The prevailing sentiment was that the revolution needed to calm down a bit. In effect, Thermidor signaled that moral certainty ceased to reassure and began to terrify. The ardent revolutionary creed that justified extraordinary violence had just discredited itself. People yearned for stability, an end to the purges. Everyone was sick of being on edge all the time. They just want to get back to normal life. I mean, what's the point in having a revolution if you don't get to enjoy afterwards, right? I mean, once you kill the king, things are meant to be good. Problem was, everything just got worse. Makes you wonder how many people thought, you know what, we should have just kept the king around. At least then we weren't getting guillotined for the slightest infraction. Anyway, one deputy famously said after Robespierre's fall, "It's as if a weight has been lifted. We can breathe again." Yet in removing the terror, Thermidor's leaders did not fully solve the Republic's crises. They still faced a war abroad, economic chaos, and royalist agitation. What Thermidor did ensure was that no single faction could easily dominate again. The men of 9 Thermidor crafted a new constitution, the Constitution of Year 3, 1795, designed to prevent the concentration of power that had allowed the terror. Executive authority was placed in a 5-man committee called the Directory, and the legislature was split into 2 councils, with indirect election and high property requirements for voting. The system aimed to fragment authority and avoid both Jacobin dictatorship and royalist restoration. In essence, it was a regime built on distrust. But this was a distrust of one-man rule, distrust of the masses, hence limited suffrage, and even distrust of politics itself. The new government had made it intentionally hard to change laws or amend the constitution. There was a logic to it, though. The hope was to achieve stability by cooling down that revolutionary furnace. The Directory that governed France from 1795 to 99 was a study in contrasts. It was the revolution's attempt to settle into a more normal constitutional regime. Yet it presided over 4 years of chronic instability. On paper, the Directory's constitution was liberal. It protected property, promoted religious toleration, and declared that liberty of the press is complete. Well, that's a far cry from the censorship under Robespierre, which, well, everybody was glad to have that gone. In practice, however, the Directory quickly gained a reputation for weakness, division, and corruption, and it never truly won the hearts of the French people. Several factors undermined the Directory's popularity. First was the war and economic woes. The war that began in 1792 continued through the Directory years, France fighting the first coalition of European powers, that is. While French armies turned the tide, winning stunning victories under young generals like Napoleon Bonaparte, get to him in a minute, the war forced the Directory to maintain high taxes and conscription, not to mention it disrupted trade. So of course the economy takes quite a beating. The revolutionary paper currency had collapsed in value by 1795, causing a runaway inflation. And by late 1795, bread once again was expensive. It cost 50 livres a loaf, when a laborer might earn 2 livres a day, which is a hell of a lot worse than the original problem. God, people must have been feeling quite ripped off with this revolution. Anyway, the Directory tried introducing a new currency, mandats, but that also plummeted to pretty much worthlessness within a year. Ultimately, they had to go back to the old metallic currency, which stabilized money but triggered deflation and a credit crunch. Throughout 1795 to 1797, ordinary people struggled with scarcity and high prices. The winters were harsh too, and people were still hungry. One Parisian woman in 1796 lamented bitterly, "First they guillotined us, now they starve us." Robespierre, at least, only killed the rich. This lot are getting the poor people waste away. Such sentiments show that many poorer citizens saw the Directory as no friend. Some even grew nostalgic for the terror's price controls. At least back in those days, bread had been cheaper. Keep your mouth shut and maybe you wouldn't starve or get guillotined at least. But on the other end of society, The Directory did very little to solve the national debt or systematic financial problems that had started the revolution in the first place. It resorted to a one-time partial default, writing off 2/3 of the debt, and relied heavily on the army's conquest to fill state coffers. Indeed, French military victories became the Directory's lifeline. Each occupied city or territory was forced to pay indemnities and yield resources to France. For example, Napoleon's 1796–97 Italian campaign. That not only defeated Austria, but it also looted immense wealth, artworks, gold, etc., some of which was sent back to France's treasury and museums. This funded the government, but also meant France's fate was increasingly tied to military success and its generals. Next, political fracture and repression. The Directory sat in the middle of two hostile camps, the resurgent royalists on one side and the Jacobin leftists on the other. Hardline Republicans felt the Directory betrayed the revolution's social ideals, while monarchists and many weary common folk of the war saw it as an ineffective stopgap regime. The result was constant plotting and upheaval. In early 1795, before the Directory was established, Paris had seen bread riots from the left. The Germinal and Prairial uprisings, of course, brutally suppressed. And a royalist armed uprising for the right, too. That was the 13 Vendémiaire, where a young General Bonaparte had helped crush without a whiff of grape shot. Well, the Directory inherited this precarious situation. To its credit, it held elections and tried constitutional rule, but the problem was when the voters expressed discontent, the Directory often annulled or overturned the results, effectively betraying its own liberal principles to stay in power. For instance, in the 1797 elections, royalists made big gains at the polls, alarming the Directory's rulers. Their solution was the coup of 4th of September 1797. With Napoleon's covert support, 3 directors deployed troops to purge the legislature of royalists and invalidate election results. They deported leading opposition deputies and imposed harsh press censorship. In 1798, when Neo-Jacobins gained seats, the Directory again intervened in the coup of 22 Floréal to oust left-wing deputies. And in mid-1799, a final internal coup, 30 Prairial, year 7 of the revolutionary calendar, removed 2 directors accused of Jacobin sympathies. All these maneuvers made it clear that the Directory, despite its facade of constitutionalism, survived only by force and a little bit of fraud, because why not? It alienated both the right and the left. It also sapped public confidence in this nascent democracy. Voter turnout plummeted. Many just saw elections as pointless theatre. So we're not so different after all. As many contemporaries observed, it's a fine farce of a republic. One group guillotines us, the next starves us, and none can govern us. Well, next there's just the general corruption and scandal. The Directory became infamous for corruption and extravagance in high places. The directors and legislative officials were often accused of taking bribes or making fortunes from war contracts and confiscated properties. Director Paul Barras, for example, lived ostentatiously and was suspected rather of illicit profiteering. Meanwhile, society in Paris during the Directory took on a rather decadent flair, the so-called Directoire style, where nouveau riches, war profiteers, and returning émigrés indulged in luxurious fashions and hedonistic balls. To ordinary citizens, this looked like the revolution's ideals had been traded for selfish enrichment by those in power. One history textbook flatly states, by 1799 the Directory was seen as weak, corrupt, and widely despised, plagued by financial scandals and administrative chaos. The public mood in the late 1790s was one of exhaustion and cynicism. As an analysis in the Bruminate notes, French society was, quote, fatigued by mobilization and suspicious of extremes. After years of revolutionary turmoil, people had grown weary of ideologies that demanded constant sacrifice and blood. Voters and elites alike now longed less for lofty ideals and more for competence and relief. The revolutionary energy had burned out into weariness. Increasingly, the question on everyone's mind became not who best embodies virtues, but rather who can end this whole cycle of crisis. People just wanted normal lives, I suppose. And it was in this atmosphere that people wanted a new kind of leader, someone who could provide stability, national glory, and an escape from chaotic politics. A strong executive perhaps was needed to get things done, even if that meant concentrating power. And then there he was, General Napoleon Bonaparte. He had risen from fame with brilliant military victories over Austria and Italy and a scientific but militarily mixed expedition in Egypt. He was young, he was charismatic, and above all, he was successful. Something the quarrelsome politicians in Paris were decidedly not. By 1799, Napoleon was easily the most popular figure in France, celebrated as the savior of the revolution's military fortunes. Meanwhile, the Directory, facing a new coalition of enemy powers and internal conspiracy, was increasingly paralyzed. Sensing opportunity, a group of plotters, including Directory insider Emmanuel Sieyes, recruited Napoleon to their cause of overthrowing the feeble government. The French were so disillusioned with the Directory that even some Republicans thought a coup might be preferable to the status quo. The sentiment was encapsulated by Sieyes' famous remark when asked what he had done during the Terror. He said, "J'ai vécu," I survived. Now, survival for the Republic seemed to demand decisive action. So on the 9th to the 10th of November 1799, the carefully staged coup unfolded, bringing General Napoleon Bonaparte to power and effectively ending the French Revolution. The coup was almost bloodless, with 2 of the 5 directors colluding and the army loyally following Napoleon. The plotters coerced the councils of the legislature to dissolve the Directory and appoint new provisional government. There was a bit of resistance, though. Legend holds that Napoleon was momentarily shaky when he faced angry deputies, and his brother Lucien had to save him, but ultimately no mass uprising came to defend the moribund regime. France, exhausted by a decade of upheaval, largely accepted the coup with a shrug. Some with a bit of relief, I assume. One reason was surely Napoleon's immense popularity with the army and the public. Another was that the coup was framed as saving the revolution from chaos, and it was insinuated a renewed Jacobin or royalist threat. The legislature was relocated out of Paris under a pretext of a false Jacobin conspiracy, conveniently placing it under Napoleon's guns. Intimidated, the representatives gave Napoleon what he wanted. The result was the establishment of the consulate, a new government with 3 consuls at the helm. But it was immediately clear who held the real power. Napoleon was named the first consul, and in the ensuing months he systematically secured control, sidelining his colleagues. Well, many contemporaries and later historians indeed view Brumaire as the full stop on the French Revolution. The democratic experiment of the 1790s was all over, and in its place was authoritarian rule by a man who would soon crown himself emperor. So why did so many people acquiesce to the rise of a strongman? Basically, accumulative fatigue and desires, the things we've examined. France in 1799 was fatigued by mobilization. Enthusiasm had worn off and people just wanted normalcy. The Directory's failures made the populace no longer convinced that virtue alone could save it. Instead, legitimacy was now measured by who could deliver stability and victory. Napoleon was there promising both. He was a victorious general who spoke the language of the revolution, at least on a surface level, while offering strong and orderly governance. To the war-weary farmers and burghers, he promised peace. To the bourgeois, he promised protection of property and an end to political vacillations that threatened their gains. And to former revolutionaries, he promised to uphold the core principles of 1789, without the disorder, of course. Basically, he was seen as the answer to that long cry of respite from politics. Now, crucially, Napoleon did not present himself as a reactionary turning back the clock to the ancient regime. Instead, he cast his rule as the fulfillment of a revolution, minus the excesses. In 1799, a number of former revolutionaries, including Sieyès, author of What is the Third Estate in 1789, willingly handed power to Bonaparte because they preferred a strong republic under one man to the instability of collective rule. They believed, or perhaps hoped, that Napoleon would safeguard the essential achievements of the revolution while providing effective leadership. And to an extent they were correct. In the years after 1799, Napoleon as first consul and later emperor did preserve and consolidate many revolutionary changes, even as he ruled autocratically. Feudal privileges and titles remained abolished. Property rights of those who had bought former church and noble lands were secured. Legal equality and merit-based advancement, key revolutionary principles were embraced by Napoleon and enshrined in the famous Napoleonic Code of 1804. Basically, he kept a modern state the revolution had built, sweeping away the last archaic feudal institutions that standardized laws across France. What ended with Napoleon's coup was a decade of Republican experiment. As first consul, Napoleon wielded more centralized power than even Louis XVI had dared, and by 1804 he would crown himself emperor, founding a new dynasty. He famously quipped that he closed the revolution. Indeed, Napoleon terminated the revolution's constant upheaval, but at the price of suppressing the electoral process and partisan politics altogether. But on the other hand, what survived were the fundamental social gains of the revolution. So, in the final analysis, and as we get to the end of our three-part series, the French Revolution did redefine citizenship, rights, and the idea of a modern state, just as promised. But it also demonstrated the perilous path that high ideals can take to coercive extremes. It began with cries of liberty. It ended with a military dictator. It proclaimed the rights of man and ended up suspending those rights in the name of public safety. The core lesson often drawn is encapsulated in this theme. When survival feels at stake, people do trade their liberty for security. During 1793 to 94, faced with external war, France's revolutionary leaders believed virtue itself compelled them to embrace terror, forced to destroy liberty in order to save it, as paradoxical as that sounds. And in 1799, the French public, tired of chaos, was willing to accept a deal from an enlightened autocrat in exchange for stability and national glory. Thus, the French Revolution's radical phase shows both the towering hopes and dark pitfalls of a society in upheaval. And you ought to be reminded that even movements born in liberty can descend into repression if they are driven by fanaticism and fear. But this whole story also left an enduring inheritance. The ideals of 1789 survived the Terror and Napoleon. Future generations in France and around the world would draw on those ideals, even as they heeded the Revolution's warning about how virtue can become coercive. In the end, the Revolution devoured many of its own, but the principles survived, and those principles, albeit tempered, would live on to inspire political thought well beyond their time. And that proves that the Revolution was both a cautionary tale, but also a foundation for our modern democratic era. Well, that's the end, guys. What did you learn today? There's a few little takeaways from that, especially about fanaticism and fear. This whole idea of movements coming about and pointing the finger at a devil behind every door. Perhaps we can try and think of some of our modern movements and spot some of these trends. Things have a way of going a little bit too far their original scope. In any case, I would like to thank you so much for listening. I hope you left a like and your thoughts in the comments, subscribe, that kind of thing. And I just hope you learned something. We're all constantly learning. I'd like to say thank you to the patrons and supporters, keeping everything ad-free, keeping this entire project going. Their names are scrolling in a moment. And I would like to thank you for joining us. Anyway, that's enough for me for today. Farewell, and I'll see you when you feel inclined to return. Goodbye for now.